Chapter 1086. The Tsangzhou provincial governor stood in the courtyard. When he saw several figures walking out of the hall, his legs went soft, and he collapsed to the ground. General Wei, General Chun, Duke, Princess, he finally realized where that ominous premonition in his heart these past few days came from. They fought back. They fought back again. The provincial governor's manor was already in chaos. Those rebels rushed in. No, they didn't seem like rebels. They were organized and disciplined. They didn't smash or rob. They only controlled the bailiffs and officials of the provincial governor's manor. There were only several dozen bailiffs in the provincial governor's manor. In front of these several hundred people, they didn't have the slightest ability to resist. Very soon, the noisy provincial governor's manor calmed down. A long time had passed, but there was still no movement from the 2,000 soldiers responsible for the security of the provincial governor's manor. The Tsangzhou provincial governor raised his head and looked outside. The place where the flames were soaring into the sky was the direction of the barracks. The only explanation was that when the provincial governor's manor was attacked, they were also attacked, and they couldn't even protect themselves. That deafening thunder and flames made him involuntarily recall the tragic scene of corpses strewn all over the Thorns Ridge that night. His entire body trembled like a sieve. Everyone in the provincial governor's manor gathered in one place. Chun Qing walked over and waved his hand, saying, "Take them away first." Attacking the provincial governor's manor was not difficult at all. The people guarding the gates were their own people, and they had long since familiarized themselves with the terrain and defenses inside. The strong citizens lying in ambush around the provincial governor's manor could catch them off guard in an instant. Wei Liang walked to the entrance of the manor and asked in a loud voice, "How is the situation outside the city?" In the distance, General Fan laughed heartily as he dismounted from his horse and said, "There's heavenly punishment, divine weapons, and 2 captains on our side. Furthermore, there's a surprise attack, working together from the inside and outside. If we still can't win this kind of battle, I, Old Fan, will cut off my own head and let you sit on it." He strode in front of Yang Liuqing, knelt on one knee, and said loudly, "Reporting to your highness, I have captured all of Tsangzhou's 2,000 soldiers. Our side has suffered 23 casualties, no serious injuries, and no deaths. In a battle of this level, it was already a miracle that only 20 or so people were lightly injured. However, considering the circumstances of the ambush, the difference in equipment, and the fact that 2 of the 4 lieutenants had defected, the first thing they did when they attacked was to take down the general and the other 2 lieutenants. As a result, the Tsangzhou garrison had no one to command them and was in a mess. This result was nothing to brag about. The thunder and fire outside the city had long since stopped, but within Tsangzhou city, almost no one was sleeping. Be it the commoners or the gentry, all of them had closed their doors. Through the cracks of their doors, they looked at the troops hurrying through the streets. Their faces were filled with worry and panic. They had been rooted in Tsangzhou for many years. How could they not know what this represented? They had seen this scene too many times. Someone had broken through the city gates and occupied the provincial governor's office. Tsangzhou was going to change again. After daybreak tomorrow, this Tsangzhou would no longer be the Tsangzhou of today. They didn't know who had broken through the city, and they didn't know how those people would treat the commoners in Tsangzhou city. They didn't even know what their future would be. But there was one thing that was beyond doubt. Tonight, no one in Tsangzhou city would be able to sleep peacefully. Wei Liang, Chun Qing, Fan Xiao, and the others also didn't sleep for the entire night. They were busy dealing with the aftermath and harvesting the fruits of victory. Once they completely took over Tsangzhou, there were even more things that needed to be done. Governing Tsangzhou, expanding the troops, repairing the city walls, defending against enemies that could appear at any time. Taking over Tsangzhou city was only the first small step of their great undertaking. The sky had just brightened when some commoners who hadn't slept for the entire night saw through the cracks of their doors that some people were putting up something on the streets. What made them curious was that among these people, there were actually people that they knew from the streets. Seeing these people walking back and forth, someone finally couldn't bear it anymore and opened a small crack in the door of his house. He shouted at the person who was putting up a notice at the end of the street. "Hey, Jean de Peo, what are you doing? You still dare to go out at this time? Do you want to die?" A man pasted the notice at the end of the street and then jumped up and patted it with all his might. After patting it firmly, he turned his head and looked at the man. He said in astonishment, "Why do I want to die? I'm just putting up a notice. It's not like I'm blocking anyone or hindering anyone. It's not illegal. What notice are you putting up?" The man opened the door wider and asked doubtfully, "Aren't you afraid that the people who entered the city yesterday would capture you? Last night, I saw from the window that they even captured the provincial governor." The man called Jean de Peo grinned and said, "Capture me? You don't know who was the one who tied the rope on the provincial governor's body yesterday." The man opened the door wider and asked doubtfully, "What does this have to do with you? Could it be that you were the one who tied the rope?" To tell you the truth, the rope on the provincial governor's body yesterday was tied by a brother beside me. Jean de Peo said with some regret, "Sigh, if I wasn't busy tying up another dog official yesterday, this good thing would have fallen on my head." "What do you mean?" The man walked out of the house and looked at Jean de Peo. He asked in astonishment, "Could it be that you also participated in the rebellion? Who was the one who fought their way in last night?" "What rebellion?" Jean de Peo waved his hand and said unhappily, "Let me tell you, the one who rebelled was the current dog emperor. He killed my father and big brother. We followed Her Highness to quell the rebellion. If you don't know anything, don't talk nonsense." "What did you say?" The man was stunned and asked, "You said that the one who fought their way in last night was Her Highness? Princess d'Uan is back." Jean de Peo nodded and said, "That's right. Otherwise, why would I put up this thing early in the morning when I had nothing to do?" The man looked at the notice and asked, "What does it say?" "I don't know what it says." Jean de Peo scratched his head and said, "But I heard that Her Highness wants to recruit people to repair the city walls. Meals will be provided and money will be provided. If they follow Her Highness to quell the rebellion, participate in the revolution, and make contributions, they will be given land when they return." While the man was stunned, Jean de Peo stuffed a stack of notices into his hands and said, "Don't just stand there. If you have nothing to do, help me put up these. I'll treat you to lunch at noon." At this moment, in the streets and alleys of Sangzhou City, someone held a large paper tube in his hand and walked through the streets, shouting all the way, "Recruiting, recruiting, repairing the city walls at the South Gate. 10 copper coins a day. Wages will be paid daily. 2 meals will be provided. Those who are interested can go to the government office to sign up. The number of people is limited. First come, first served. Recruiting, recruiting, Her Highness is recruiting. Join the army today, get your pay tomorrow, and you will be given land in the future." The commoners hid in their homes. They couldn't see the notice, but they could understand the human language. They were shocked. The one who fought their way into the city last night was Princess d'Uan. Her Highness was back. Everyone said that the person with the mandate of heaven was coming. Could it be Her Highness? Yes, it must be. When Princess d'Uan was born, she was protected by a phoenix. Even the stars in the sky said that she didn't have an ordinary life. She was blessed by God. Wasn't this the person with the mandate of heaven? They didn't believe in the government or anyone else, but they believed in the princess. They prayed to the stars and the moon every day, hoping for this day. They hoped that Her Highness would come back to save them. An old man pushed open the door and walked to the street. He stopped a soldier who was holding a paper tube and asked with a trembling voice, "Is Her Highness back?" The soldier nodded. The old man sat on the ground and cried, "Her Highness is back. We've been waiting for Her Highness to come back." More and more commoners walked out of their homes and onto the streets. They looked at the notices in the city and looked at each other in confirmation. The whole city was in an uproar at this moment. The whole city was jubilant. Her Highness is back. Her Highness is finally back. Our bitter days are coming to an end. It turns out that Her Highness is the person with the mandate of heaven. It turns out that the person with the mandate of heaven is Her Highness. I want to join the army. I want to follow Her Highness to conquer the world. Even God said that Her Highness is the life of an emperor. She will definitely succeed. I still have an old mother at home. I can't follow Her Highness. I plan to sign up to build the city wall and make the wall thicker so that no one can break in. Overnight, the Tsangzhou provincial governor's mansion had been changed into the Princess Mansion, which was also the temporary command center of the Revolutionary Army. In front of the Princess Mansion, the commoners of Tsangzhou gathered. An old lady with a hunched body carried a basket and said, "Sir, I'm not going to see Her Highness. This old lady doesn't dare to disturb Her Highness. This basket of eggs was laid by the old hen at home. Please help me to bring them in. This old lady has no strength to build the city wall or fight. This is a small gift for the soldiers to nourish their bodies." A strong man carried half a bag of pork on his back and put on the steps of the door. He said, "This meat is for the soldiers. I won't sell meat in the future. I will join the army tomorrow. These few bolts of cloth are for the soldiers to make clothes. These 2 fishes were just caught yesterday. I can't take out anything else. This is a small gift." The crowd consciously moved forward bit by bit. People said 1 or 2 words, or simply said nothing. They put down the things and turned to leave. The people's hearts and destiny. Li Yi and Mississippi Lu sat side by side on the roof. He patted her thigh and pointed to the crowd below. He sighed and said, "Do you see? This is the real person with the mandate of heaven." Chapter 1087. The status of Yang Liuqing in the hearts of the Tsangzhou people was far beyond Li Yi's expectations. If the current emperor of the Wu Kingdom could achieve such a status in the hearts of the people, then the rebels of the Wu Kingdom could be easily wiped out without much effort. This, of course, had something to do with the policy of being close to the people during her 2 years in Tsangzhou. Even without the rumors spread by the brothels, the people of Tsangzhou were still hoping that she would return as soon as possible. This would save them a lot of trouble. News had already spread from the various government offices in Tsangzhou. Within Tsangzhou City alone, the people who volunteered to enlist had formed a long queue in front of the 3 government offices. If they held hands, they could probably circle the entire city. Part of the reason was that they could get a tael of silver immediately after enlisting, but another important reason was their trust and support for Yang Liuqing. The number of people who applied to build the city walls was also innumerable. As the base of the rear, the city walls of Tsangzhou had to be especially sturdy. Apart from that, the structure had to be greatly modified to adapt to the new tactics. This project was urgent. The news of the change of ownership of Tsangzhou would soon spread. It wouldn't take long for the imperial court of the Wu Kingdom to formulate a strategy and send troops to clear out the city. They needed to build this place into an impregnable fortress before the enemy arrived. Li Yi was initially worried that they wouldn't have enough manpower to deal with certain situations, so he wanted to transfer some people from Rui City over. Now, it seemed that there was no need for that at all. In a short period of time, their troops would be able to expand by more than 10 times. With the support of the fringe, they wouldn't lack food, manpower, or divine punishment. Soon, they wouldn't even lack Italian cannons. Even if there were 100,000 soldiers outside, they would be able to wear them down even if they couldn't defeat them. Li Yi looked at the increasing crowd below and sighed. "Your disciple is very powerful. I know my disciple is very powerful." Mississippi Lu looked at him and shifted her gaze to his hand. "What does this have to do with you putting your hand on my leg?" Li Yi couldn't say that he was afraid of heights. When Mississippi Lu brought him up, she didn't consider his opinion. If he didn't grab something with his hand, he wouldn't feel at ease. The officials didn't want to change and didn't care about governance. They only wanted to squeeze the last drop of blood from the people. The Wu Kingdom's imperial court had long lost its credibility in Tsangzhou. This made it especially smooth when Yang Liuqing took over Tsangzhou. The people lined the streets to welcome them and were extremely cooperative with their work in Tsangzhou. If the citizens of the other prefectures and prefectures of the Wu country were to cooperate as well, then his precious martial nephew would only need to raise his voice, and the emperor of the Wu country would only be able to stay in the imperial palace. He might even be killed in his sleep by some eunuch or palace maid. Of course, revolution couldn't be imagined. It had to be done step by step and be down to earth. Li put his hands behind his head and lay down. Looking at the rare blue sky in winter, he suddenly asked, Rui, after we defeat the imperial court of the Wu Kingdom and Yangliuking becomes the empress, what are your plans? Mississippi Lu had already realized her dream of becoming the king of bandits. Even her disciple was about to realize her dream of becoming a king. The only two things in life that hadn't been fulfilled was that, as a martial artist, she hadn't become a martial arts master yet. As a woman, she hadn't found the man she could rely on for the rest of her life. The former was an illusory realm that could only be encountered and not sought. It could only be left to fate. The latter couldn't be forced, couldn't be found, couldn't be begged. Although it couldn't be forced, there was an old saying that said, I've been looking for him in the crowd for thousands of times, but when I suddenly look back, he's in the dim light. It made some sense. Mississippi Lu thought for a while and lay down beside him. She said, in this world, there's still many places that I haven't been to. Maybe I'll go for a walk alone, wearing fresh clothes and riding a horse, holding a sword. Since the Lantern Festival that year, Mississippi Lu's literacy level had soared at a terrifying speed. She didn't know many words, but now she could casually recite poems and idioms, sometimes quoting from the classics. Even he had to think about it to understand. Now, she was wearing fresh clothes and riding a horse, holding a sword, and seemed to be changing into a literary heroine. Mississippi Lu looked up at the sky and said, what about you? Are you going to get to know another princess of the Qi Kingdom? Why would I get to know a princess of the Qi Kingdom? Li glanced at her and said, when things here are over, I'll go back to the capital, and then what? And then, that's not the point. Were we just now? How can you travel alone with a sword? Jianghu is dangerous, and it's too dangerous for a girl to travel alone. On the roof, Li and Rui were talking about life, dreams, and romantic things. In the conference room, Yang Liuqing was already discussing the next step of the plan with the higher-ups in the army. Prime Minister Wang stood up and walked to a small board. He said, now that we've taken over Changzhou and purged most of the bandits in the city, the conflict between the people, the government, and the bandits has been eliminated. However, for the people, the most important thing is land, the means of production, and the conflict with the rich and powerful landowners. Jiang of Silla's suggestion is that we can't kill them all at once. We should attack some of them and draw some of them to our side. After the old man with the surname Wang finished, Wei Liang stood up and walked to a huge map. He pointed at the area around Changzhou and said, these 5 provinces are very close to Changzhou. Among them, Nanzhou is an important military town with more than 10,000 soldiers. The other 4 provinces can also gather nearly 10,000 soldiers. In other words, when the news from Changzhou reaches the imperial court, we may be surrounded and attacked by 20,000 soldiers. A revolution can't be built in one place. We have to defend Changzhou, but we also need to expand the war as soon as possible. We need to unite all the rebel forces in these 5 provinces and create even more chaos. The news from Changzhou will soon reach the imperial capital. We don't have much time left. November of the 4th year of Wu Yuan. Everyone in Changzhou was a soldier. Her Highness had entered Changzhou half a month ago. Although most of the people had been waiting for this for a long time, there was no doubt that the imperial court would not ignore this. They would soon face the imperial court's purge. Before this, they needed to build the city walls even thicker, taller, and sturdier. Only then would they be able to stop the incoming enemies. The notice personally written by the former prime minister had already spread throughout Changzhou. The current emperor had killed his brother and father, ignoring the will of the heavens. He had already lost the virtue of an emperor. He had also caused the entire Wu kingdom to fall apart, and rebels were rising everywhere. He was no longer fit to be an emperor. At this time, the emperor's star had fallen, and the celestial phenomenon had given a warning. Princess Duanrong had followed the will of the previous emperor and raised troops to suppress the rebels. This notice had been pasted throughout the streets and alleys of Changzhou within half a day. It was also spread by storytellers in the brothels and gradually spread to even further places. in the great hall within the palace walls of the imperial capital of the Wu Kingdom. Ha! The martial emperor's face was ashen. In front of the hundreds of officials in the imperial court, he suddenly threw down a memorial. The notice contained within the memorial landed next to the feet of an official. I really have a good sister. Pass down my order. Order the governor of Nan province to be the great general of white cavalry. He will lead the troops guarding the 5 provinces and immediately set out to recapture Tsangzhou. He looked down with a sinister gaze and gritted his teeth. At all costs. Chapter 1088. Stop the rebellion in Tsangzhou at all costs, dead or alive. The court was silent. All the civil and military officials lowered their heads in silence. Only the martial emperor's angry voice echoed. It wasn't until the court was over and the officials walked out of the main hall and the palace gates that the oppressive atmosphere showed signs of dissipating. An official caught up with a general in front and asked in a low voice, "General Chung, what's going on? Didn't King Jing die a long time ago? What's going on with the rebellion in Tsangzhou? If you have any questions, you can ask His Majesty personally. I still have important matters to attend to, so I'll take my leave first." The general cupped his hands casually and strode away. The official looked at his back and shook his head helplessly. Princess Duan Rong and King Jing had always been thorns in His Majesty's heart. Other than confidants like General Chung, who dared to mention them in front of His Majesty. No matter how many people in the Wu Kingdom rebelled and proclaimed themselves as kings, they were still rebels. However, Princess Duan Rong and King Jing were different. They were of the same origin as His Majesty and were both legitimate members of the Wu Kingdom. Justice stood on their side. His Majesty was afraid. After 2 years, Princess Duan Rong had made a comeback. Tsangzhou was suddenly seized, and Prime Minister Wang had personally written the surrender document, which revealed almost all his evil deeds to the public. The document had even reached the imperial capital. Before long, all the people in the Wu Kingdom would know that their emperor had killed his brother and father and slaughtered his entire clan. He was heartless and could not be tolerated by the heavens. He would be punished by both humans and gods. His Majesty no longer pretended to be close to his brother and was secretive like before. In front of all the civil and military officials, he gave the order to stop at all costs, dead or alive. He wanted to use power and force to shut everyone's mouths. Among the officials who dispersed, some looked calm, some looked confused, and some looked worried. In the rear hall of the palace, the martial emperor stood in the hall and looked at a eunuch. He said, "Add Yang Fu's reward to her as well. In addition, add another 100,000 taels of silver. Tell those so-called chivalrous martial artists that anyone who can take Princess Duan Rong's head will be rewarded 300,000 taels of silver." The eunuch bowed and said, "Yes, Your Majesty. Great ancestor, great ancestor, great ancestor. You can't go in." Boom! Suddenly, a chaotic sound came from outside the hall, and then the hall door shattered with a loud bang. "Yang Zhe, I shouldn't have let you live in this world from the very beginning." The old man with white hair and beard walked in from outside. He looked at the martial monarch and spoke with a cold and murderous voice. "Imperial uncle." The martial emperor looked at him, smiled, and said, "Of the men of the Yang dynasty, only you and I are left. What does it matter if another insignificant woman dies? Since that's the case, this old man will send you to see your father and brother." A voice that sounded like tearing silk came from within the hall. The white-haired old man disappeared from where he stood, and when he reappeared, he was already in front of the martial emperor. He formed a claw with his fingers and fiercely grabbed at the martial emperor's throat. His speed was extremely fast, and the eunuch beside the martial emperor was sent flying. The martial emperor felt as if he had been locked onto by a powerful aura, and a burning pain came from his throat. Death had never been so close to him. A trace of fear appeared in his eyes, as well as a trace of anxiety. Bang! After a muffled sound, the martial emperor took a few steps back and fell to the ground, gasping for breath. A silhouette appeared where he had been standing a moment ago. It was an old woman with a head full of white hair, but there were not many wrinkles on her face. She reached out a hand and grabbed the white-haired old man's wrist. When the martial emperor saw that the old man was stopped, he panted and laughed at the same time. His laughter grew louder and louder. Imperial, imperial uncle. Aren't you a master? Aren't you invincible? Kill me, I'm right here, come over. The old man's expression finally changed when his wrist was grabbed. Grandmaster. This old woman was also a grandmaster. He looked at her and asked with a frown, "Who are you? Why are you interfering in the affairs of the imperial family?" The old woman's expression was calm. She let go of his hand and said calmly, "He still owes me one thing. You can't kill him." The old man's expression became calm. He did not know where Yang Zhe had found this master, nor did he want to know. He looked at her and said, "If that's the case, then let's see if you have the ability to do so." As soon as he finished speaking, his body flickered and went straight for the martial emperor behind the old woman. Bang! Another muffled sound came from within the hall. The old woman's figure was even faster than him. She appeared in front of the martial emperor and blocked his path once again. The smile on the martial emperor's face became even wider, and he said mockingly, "Imperial uncle, if you don't hurry over, I'm afraid you can only collect the corpse of your most beloved princess, Duanrong." The white-haired old man stood where he was, but he no longer attacked. Instead, he looked at the old woman with a bewildered and uncertain gaze and asked, pursuing shadow, "Who are you to Su Tian? You know Su Tian?" The old woman's expression changed for the first time. Her voice suddenly rose, and it even sounded a little sharp. This pursuing shadow movement technique was created by that old man when he was young, and it was also the thing that he was most proud of. He often bragged about it, and he treated it like a treasure. Back then, he didn't even teach this movement technique to me. The white-haired old man looked at him and said in a slightly slow tone, "He actually passed this movement technique to you. Could it be that you're a disciple that he took later on?" The old woman didn't answer him. After the initial excitement, her emotions had already calmed down, and she asked, "Are you very familiar with Su Tian?" The white-haired old man said, "When we were young, we could be considered to be close friends." The old woman's gaze was blank as she muttered, "Close friends." Back then, the two of us were only a step away from becoming a grandmaster. We made a bet on who would be the first to break through that barrier. When the white-haired old man recalled the past, he didn't notice the resentment and jealousy in the old woman's voice at all. He was still talking nonstop. Back then, my cultivation level was even higher than his. He was indignant in his heart, and in order to win against me, he cut off all distracting thoughts, abandoned everything, and went into closed-door training for several years. The old woman closed her eyes and muttered, "In order to win against you, he cut off all distracting thoughts, abandoned everything, and went into closed-door training for several years." She deliberately emphasized the words cut off and abandoned. The old man nodded and then asked doubtfully, "Since you are his disciple, did he never mention me to you?" As soon as he finished speaking, his expression suddenly changed. He raised an arm, clenched his other hand into a fist, and suddenly punched forward. Bang! His body flew backward, and a trace of blood flowed from the corner of his mouth. He glared angrily at the old woman, who also spat out blood, and said angrily, "Are you crazy?" The old woman didn't speak, and what responded to him was an attack that was even fiercer than before. Crazy woman, crazy woman. Stop. If this goes on, both of us will only suffer. Stop. I know Su Tian. I know Su Tian. Ever since he arrived at the Wu Kingdom, Su was often in a daze, as if he was immersed in some kind of memory. He didn't say anything, and Li Yi was too embarrassed to ask. He had been sitting there alone for a long time, and the meat on the drumstick had been eaten clean by him. Even the bones were full of teeth marks. A black dog had been squatting not far away from him since he took the drumstick. The dog's eyes were wide open, and it looked at him without blinking. The dog's eyes were originally full of hope, but now they were close to despair. When Feng walked in from outside, Li Yi finally couldn't help but say, "Go to the kitchen and tell them to add another drumstick for Su later. I'll add the drumstick later." Fong shook his head and handed a letter to Li Yi, saying, "Young master, you should take a look at this first." Li Yi opened the letter, and after reading it, he shook his head slightly. 300,000 taels of silver to buy the life of his beloved martial nephew. This was the most stingy emperor he had ever seen. Mississippi Lu's disciple, his martial nephew of the Jiang of Silla, was only worth 300,000 taels of silver? He thought for a moment, looked at Fong, and said, "Inform Lu Luo to send out hero posters, offering a reward of 1,000,000 taels of silver for the head of the emperor of the Wu Kingdom, and 10 divine weapons that could cut through hair as if they were mud. They are accepting custom orders, and free shipping is included. In addition, 10,000 points on the hero ranking list will be rewarded. You can also customize a novel with the theme of martial arts heroes based on the hero himself, and the novel will be spread in the brothel." Chapter 1089. In the past 2 months, Nanzhou, Linzhou, Yunzhou, these 5 states have been mobilizing their troops frequently. Our spies have reported that the military governor of Nanzhou has been temporarily appointed as the great general of cavalry. They want to gather the troops of the 5 states and take down Sangzhou in one fell swoop. Wei Liang stood in front of a huge sand table. He had planted 5 flags around a sand dune with the word Sangzhou written on it. He pointed at the flag in the middle and drew a line with a tree branch. He said, "These 5 states have about 20,000 troops that can be mobilized at the moment. They have been secretly mobilizing for 2 months. In half a month at most, they will directly attack Sangzhou." Li Yi stood outside the door and listened to the analysis of the battle situation for a while. He wasn't surprised and walked away slowly. He had thought that the imperial court's counterattack would be swift and fierce. Who would have thought that after he went back for the new year, 2 to 3 months had passed. He had already brought Rui and the others to Sangzhou for a vacation, and the other party was still mobilizing their troops? Let them do it. There was no hurry. There were more than 20,000 people. As long as this number didn't increase tenfold, Sangzhou would be fine. After they took down Sangzhou a few months ago, they had recruited many citizens. Now, their troops had expanded to more than 10,000 people. During this time, Wei Liang and the others had distributed some experienced soldiers to train the new recruits. When Li Yi returned to the army camp after 2 months, the army looked completely different. The joint attack of the 5 states this time was the determination of the imperial court of the Wu Kingdom. To them, it was an opportunity that they had been waiting for a long time. Su Zheng had already brought people to those states before the new year. Due to the heavily guarded armies in those states, there hadn't been any big movements. They could only develop in secret. Mississippi Lu had also brought people to subdue a few rebel forces and had long since set her eyes on the state capital. Everything was ready. They were just waiting for them to attack. It wasn't that everything was ready. They still lacked a few scripts. The new drama, The Legend of the Assassin, that had been released in the Wu Kingdom was about to end. In a tea house outside the state capital of a certain state in the Wu Kingdom. There is a saying in the history books. Zhuangju's assassination of Wang Liao was like a comet striking the moon. Nie Zheng's assassination of Han Xiao was like a white rainbow piercing the sun. Yao Li's assassination of Qing Ji was like a hawk striking the palace. In the shabby tea house, an old man with a grizzled beard sat at the very front. His voice rose and fell in cadence. In ancient times, some powerful assassins would even be warned by celestial phenomena when they took action. According to legend, when Zhuangju assassinated King Liao of Wu, the tail of a comet swept across the moon. When Ye Zheng assassinated Han, and a white light shot straight up to the sun. When Yao Li assassinated Qing Ji, a goshawk swooped down on the palace. These 3 are the 3 great assassins we'll be talking about today. Although the tea house wasn't overcrowded, there were no empty seats. There were ordinary people taking a break in the tea house, as well as travel-worn swordsmen holding swords and knives. However, most of them were Jianghu people carrying weapons. They were all attracted by the old man's story. When he heard something happy, he would take out a copper coin from his pocket and place it in a broken bowl in front of the old man. The Jianghu and the court seemed to be very far apart, but they were actually very closely related. What happened in the court was closely related to the Jianghu. Once the court collapsed, the Jianghu people wouldn't be able to stand alone. The Wu kingdom revered martial arts. Whether it was the poor, the gentry, or even the powerful royal family, although they didn't value martial arts more than literature, their rejection and contempt for martial arts were far inferior to other countries. When a country was stable, there were still wanderers who killed people on the streets. Now that the country was in chaos, the Jianghu, which was already not clear, became even more muddy. The so-called chivalrous people relied on their martial arts to despise the law and viewed human life as nothing more than grass. They hired assassins to kill, offered rewards for assassinations. They couldn't stop despite being banned. Because of their martial arts, they were naturally very interested in the stories of the Jianghu. These days, the heroic stories that circulated in the brothels and small storytelling houses in the various provinces were very popular in the Jianghu. What the old man was talking about was the biography of the assassins. It recorded dozens of assassin stories from ancient to modern times. They weren't just simple stories about chivalrous people in the Jianghu. Some of them involved brotherhood, love between men and women, and there was no lack of chivalrous people who served their country and its people at the same time. There's also a list of assassins in the Jianghu. The list recorded the famous assassins in the Wu kingdom. Behind them, there was a detailed list of the person's life story and the reason why they were on the list. These things have been circulating in the Jianghu in the past in the Wu kingdom, but no one had ever organized these things together and made such a ranking. There were 10 positions on the list, and there were only 9 assassins. No one knew who made this list, but there was a sentence that almost everyone knew. There were only 10 positions on the list, and only these 10 people could be called assassins. Those who couldn't even get on the list weren't assassins, but trash. The reason why there were only 9 assassins on the list was because the top position of the list was empty. There was only a short line of a poem. Guests of Zhao wear tassels, bright as the frost and snow of the Wu hook. The silver saddle shines on the white horse, galloping like a shooting star. Kill a man in 10 steps, unstoppable for 1,000 miles. When the matter is done, leave with a brush of the robe, hiding your identity and name. This was a poem that described chivalrous people. It was said that in ancient times, there were many chivalrous people in the land of Yin and Zhao. What this poem described was the charm of the chivalrous people in the land of Yin and Zhao. The hat was decorated with tassels, and the sword was as bright as the frost and snow of the Wu hook. The silver saddle and the white horse reflected each other, galloping like a shooting star. Within 10 steps, kill a man, 1,000 miles pass, unstoppable. When a matter is done, leave with a brush of the robe, leaving no trace, hiding your identity and name. This poem described a chivalrous person or an assassin to the peak. Kill a man in 10 steps, unstoppable for 1,000 miles. When a matter is done, leave with a brush of the robe, hiding your identity and name. This was what an assassin should be, an assassin with the highest realm. According to the person who created the assassin ranking, this poem had been written for the top of the assassin ranking. It had always been waiting for someone to ascend to that position, someone worthy of these few lines of poetry. As the old man narrated, many people in the tea house showed expressions of excitement. The top of the assassin list for a chivalrous person or an assassin was almost the greatest glory. In the corner, there were 2 people talking in low voices. It is said that Princess Duan Rong's bounty has increased by another 50,000, a total of 350,000 taels of silver. If we can succeed, we should be qualified to be the top of the assassin list, right? There has never been such a high bounty. If we can't even do this, who else is qualified? Who knows how many people have gathered in Sangzhou, and they all have the same goal as us. It is easier said than done to succeed. As the 2 people talked in low voices, a sneer suddenly came from beside them. What the 2 of you are talking about is old news. A man with a knife at the next table turned to look at them and said, "On the bounty list, The highest bounty is 1,000,000 taels of silver and 10 divine weapons. To be favored by a storyteller, to help you become famous, to receive guidance from Grandmaster, and to be able to ascend to the top of the assassin list in one go. You too must not pay attention to current affairs, right? In the corner, someone was startled and said with a smile, "Brother, I'm afraid you're dreaming. 1,000,000 taels of silver, 10 divine weapons, and guidance from Grandmaster. Whose head is worth so much silver? You must have met a swindler, right?" The other person nodded and said, "Everyone knows that this bounty on Princess Duanrong was actually inspired by the current emperor. Could it be that in this Wu kingdom, there is someone more wealthy and trustworthy than the emperor?" Hearing this, the man smiled and said, "If the current emperor is trustworthy, then those traitors who were recruited by the imperial court to ambush Princess Duanrong would not have disappeared from the imperial capital." Hearing this, the two people were startled and asked, "Then do you have proof of what you said? That 1,000,000 taels of silver and 10 divine weapons has already been verified by 10 legendary figures of the martial world. Go out and ask around, and you will know." The two people still did not believe it and asked suspiciously, "In this world, whose head is so valuable?" The man stretched out a finger and pointed to the sky. The two people were startled again, and then their expressions changed at the same time. One of them had a terrified expression and asked, "Who has eaten the heart of a bear and the heart of a leopard to dare to assassinate the emperor?" "Let's stop here for today." In front, the old man tidied up the stall and said, "Tomorrow, we will talk about Jingku assassinating the king of Qin." He waved his hand and said, "Same old time, same old place. We will not leave until we see each other." Chapter 1090. The Jianghu of the Wu Kingdom was a Jianghu without many restrictions. Ever since the collapse of the country, even the last bit of restrictions had disappeared. Here, human lives are like grass. Whether it was the lives of ordinary people, high officials, or even the lives of princesses and princes, they could all be clearly priced. However, this was the first time they had heard of a bounty for the emperor's head. 1,000,000 taels of silver, 10 divine weapons, guidance from a grandmaster, fame in the brothel. Apart from pursuing martial arts, what people who practiced martial arts wanted was fame and fortune. This assassination mission almost satisfied all of their desires. There were countless people in the Wu Kingdom who wanted to rebel and kill the emperor, but this was worlds apart from putting the emperor's head on a bounty list with a clear price. Come to think of it, assassinating an emperor was much more difficult than assassinating a princess, and it was easier to become famous. None of the famous assassins in history had become famous by assassinating a princess. Regardless of whether there was such a bold assassin, the fact that he dared to accept this mission and put a bounty on the emperor's head was a pioneering act that was rarely seen in the Jianghu for hundreds of years. It was widely spread throughout the entire Wu Kingdom. With such a generous bounty and conditions, there were naturally many people who were tempted. However, the emperor had lived in the depths of the palace for a long time, and there were countless guards around him. There were many experts in the palace. Without the strength of a grandmaster, it was easier said than done to sneak into the palace and assassinate him. Unless there was a way for him to walk out of the depths of the palace and out of the imperial capital. In the imperial capital, the officials had just left the court, and they were still digesting the news they had just heard. Just now, the emperor had announced in front of the officials that he would personally lead the army to quell the many rebellions in the country. This news was very sudden. Although the emperor personally leading the army could greatly increase morale, it would also bring greater problems. They could understand the emperor's eagerness. In order to sit on the throne, he had killed his brothers, his father, and his own people. Under the throne, there were mountains of corpses and seas of blood. The people did not accept him and did not recognize him as the emperor. He needed to do some things to stabilize his position. There is nothing better than personally leading the army to quell rebellions and stabilize the situation in the country to establish his prestige as the emperor. Not to mention how to guarantee His Majesty's safety, Just the amount of supplies and fodder that had to be prepared in the early stage would deplete the national treasury savings. If they were conscripted from all over the country, it would definitely increase the burden on the local government, which would increase the burden on the common people. The common people would not be able to survive and could only revolt. If one rebellion was wiped out, there would probably be 10 more. This was a conflict that could not be resolved. However, it was difficult to disobey the emperor's orders. His Majesty made arbitrary decisions. In the past, there were ministers in the censorate who remonstrated to the death. After they really died, the censorate of the Wu kingdom only existed in name. None of the civil and military officials dared to disobey his orders. In the rear hall, "Your Majesty is wise and mighty, and you command the army like a god." If those traitors knew that Your Majesty was going to lead the army personally, they would have surrendered long ago. There would be no need to waste so much effort. The martial emperor waved his hand, interrupting the flattery of a eunuch, and asked, "Is there any result to the matter I asked you to look into?" "Your Majesty, there is news." The eunuch hurriedly said, "Ever since that day, the old ancestor has not returned to the imperial capital, and that senior has also disappeared. Many people have seen the scene of the two of them fighting outside the imperial capital. He's actually not dead yet." A trace of disappointment appeared on the martial emperor's face, and then he waved his hand and said, "Pass down the order. The things that I need to personally go to the imperial household department, prepare them as soon as possible." "Yes, Your Majesty," the eunuch bowed and replied. Before he could retreat, another eunuch ran in panic and said in panic, "Your Majesty, Your Majesty." The martial emperor frowned and asked, "Why are you so flustered?" The eunuch knelt on the ground, trembling as he handed over a letter, and said, This is the news that reached the imperial capital today." The martial emperor stretched out his hand to take it, tore open the envelope, and looked at it. Not long after, his face became completely gloomy. He tore the letter into pieces and said angrily, "Treacherous, treacherous, who issued this bounty? Who did it?" He was so angry that his entire body was trembling, and he roared, "Investigate! Investigate this thoroughly. If I really want to hack this person into pieces, I will execute his entire family." The dignified monarch of a country was actually placed on the bounty list, and his head was worth 1,000,000 taels of silver and 10 pieces of scrap metal. This was a humiliation that he would never be able to wash away in his lifetime. The eunuch trembled and said, "Your Majesty, I've already investigated. That person did not leave his name, nor did he leave any clues. Trash, trash. What use do I have for trash like you?" The martial emperor waved his hand and said, "Men, drag him out." The eunuch's face was pale as he knelt on the ground, and he hurriedly said, "Your Majesty, spare me, spare me." 2 guards with sabers quickly ran in, looked at the eunuch kneeling on the ground, and pulled out the long sabers at their waists. "Stop." The martial emperor looked at them, and his gaze moved to the weapons in their hands. He took 2 steps back and said coldly, "Who allowed you to bring weapons in?" The 2 of them stopped in their tracks and looked at each other with a blank expression. The martial emperor looked at the 2 of them coldly, stepped down. The emperor's recent actions were a little unusual, which puzzled the officials. On the first day, he announced the news of the imperial army personally going into battle and ordered the officials to prepare immediately, without delay. The next morning, during the morning court, he arranged other matters for the officials in charge of this matter, and did not mention the matter of the imperial army personally going into battle. The official had only asked a question and was beaten 20 times. From then on, no one in the court dared to mention the matter of the imperial army personally going into battle. This was the biggest national matter since the beginning of the year, and it was silently shelved. Secondly, he also strictly ordered that except for the city defense troops, the imperial guards in the palace were not allowed to bring any sharp weapons within 300 feet of the emperor's palace. They were all changed to sticks, and bows and arrows were not allowed to be brought into the palace. Even when the officials went to the court, they had to undergo extremely strict inspection. When they entered the palace, they had to first enter a small room, take off their clothes, and be searched before they could go to the hall. In addition, the food made by the kitchen had to be tasted 10 times. When the emperor went to bed, there were no less than 300 guards outside the bedchamber, and the experts in the palace were always by his side. The officials only found out later that there was actually someone who was extremely daring and rebellious, and used 1,000,000 taels of silver as a reward for the emperor's head. Not to mention the value of the 10 divine weapons that could cut iron like mud. The current national treasury of the Wu Kingdom could not even take out 1,000,000 taels of silver. It was unknown who had such a large amount of money. Did their family's money all fall from the sky? In a certain province of the Wu Kingdom, the sky had just brightened, and there were few pedestrians on the official road. At a certain moment, a black suddenly appeared on the horizon at the end of the official road. The speed of the black was extremely fast. When it got closer, it was discovered that it was an old man with disheveled hair and ragged clothes. The old man was travel-worn, and his hair had already been frozen. There was a trace of blood at the corner of his mouth that had not dried yet. He suddenly turned his head and said loudly, "Crazy woman, you spared no effort to chase me for more than 2 months. When have I, Yang Wanli, ever offended you?" Behind him, an old woman on a horse didn't answer. She drew her bow and shot an arrow. The old man moved his body to the side and narrowly dodged it. At this moment, the depression in his heart had reached its peak. This old woman's martial arts were on par with his, but she was an out-and-out crazy woman. When she fought, she would not care about the consequences. She would injure herself and hurt the enemy 1,000 times. Even if he could defeat her, he was afraid that his cultivation level would drop and his foundation would be destroyed. There would be no hope for him to break through in this lifetime. Therefore, he could only avoid her. As a result, she relentlessly chased him for more than 2 months. Even though he was a member of the royal family, had great self-restraint, and had cultivated his character for a long time, he couldn't help but feel angry at this moment. He turned his head and said loudly, "Crazy woman, what enmity do I have with you? Why do you hate me so much? Could it be that this old man stole your man when I was young?" Shio, shio, shio. This time, 3 arrows were shot consecutively. Chapter 1091. 1,000,000 taels of silver wasn't a lot. Li didn't know how much money his family had. Ruoqing was the housekeeper of the family. She was in charge of the operations of the brothel and the shop. If there was a need for money, she could withdraw it directly from the accountant. If he could solve the problem of the Wu Kingdom with 1,000,000 taels of silver, it would be a great deal. Unfortunately, the emperor of the Wu Kingdom was holed up in the palace. The palace was heavily guarded and had many experts. No matter how powerful an assassin was, it was unlikely that he could succeed in such an environment. He didn't pin his hopes on those martial arts heroes. Even if he couldn't buy the head of a martial emperor, it was enough to disgust him. Su Zheng, who was in the Nanzhou, had just sent news yesterday that the governor of the Nanzhou had gathered more than 20,000 troops from the surrounding 4 prefectures and counties. He had also prepared provisions and supplies. He wanted to take down Sangzhou in one fell swoop and would immediately send troops. The Nanzhou wasn't far from Sangzhou. If they marched urgently, they would arrive in 3 days. If they weren't in such a hurry, they should arrive in 5 days. Wei Liang and the others were already discussing the tactics to face the enemy. In terms of numbers, they only had half of the enemy's troops. But in terms of strength, these 10,000 people were equivalent to an army of tens of thousands. What they needed to do was to achieve victory with the least losses. Of the 73 prefectures of the Wu Kingdom, more than half were still under the control of the Wu Kingdom's imperial court. They only occupied the small Sangzhou. There was still a long way to go. If they were to face 20,000 troops, they would have to pay a heavy price to win. How could they fight in the future? Everyone was very busy recently. As the chief commander of the defense of the city, Wei Liang needed to discuss with his subordinates to formulate a strategy to deal with the enemy. Old man Wang was busy fleecing the landlords and old money bags. To a certain extent, he had to redistribute the production materials. He also had to appease the village gentry who had become restless after being fleeced and not cause more chaos. In addition, he had to select some educated and capable people to manage the grassroots troops. Rebelling was not as simple as fighting and killing. It was a very complicated and tedious task. Fortunately, Yang Liuqing had a group of reliable leaders by his side. Otherwise, the troops that they had painstakingly built would have collapsed from within before they could even reach the imperial capital. After lunch, Li Yi and Rui Ruoqing went out for a walk. Song Prefecture was different from Shu Prefecture and Rui City. The people here had suffered from the chaos of war and knew how difficult it was to achieve peace. In front of a great enemy, almost everyone in Sangzhou City was a soldier. The citizens did their best. Even if they could not personally participate in the battle, they helped to move the black logs and rolling stones to the city walls. On the streets, people were rushing. Compared to Shuzhou and Rui City, it was a different kind of liveliness. Rui and Ruoqing preferred peace and quiet. They probably didn't like this kind of liveliness. What they liked was to settle down in a place and live a simple and stable life. Or they could abandon worldly affairs and be together as a family. They could go anywhere for the past few years. He had made them run all over the place with him. Ruoqing had also inexplicably become the empress and shouldered an even heavier burden. It was really difficult for them. If they could conquer the 5 prefectures this time, Yang Liuqing will be able to thoroughly establish a foothold in the northwest of the Wu Kingdom. Apart from the imperial court, they would be the greatest power in the Wu Kingdom. Unless the imperial court of the Wu Kingdom mobilized all of its military forces and gathered hundreds of thousands of soldiers to encircle and annihilate them in one fell swoop. Otherwise, no one would be able to do anything to them. After this, he could completely relax. The situation in the 5 prefectures was stable. Mississippi Liu also didn't need to worry about her precious disciple anymore. Song Prefecture's military camp. Wei Liang had just received a secret letter. After he opened it in front of everyone, he said in a low voice, "News from Nanzhou. The enemy will fall into the trap in 5 days. Inform the entire army to prepare for battle." Nanzhou, in front of the capital. A general wearing armor rode on a horse. A deputy general beside him dismounted and knelt on one knee. He cupped his hands and said, "Reporting to the general, General Zheng is leading a vanguard of 2,000. They are escorting the provisions and are already 30 li away. Depart." The general nodded. He turned his head and said in a low voice, "Follow me to suppress the traitors. Suppress the traitors. Suppress the traitors. Suppress the traitors." The army of 20,000 stood neatly behind him and shouted in unison. Their voices echoed several li away and could be clearly heard throughout Nanzhou City. The provincial governor of Nanzhou stood on top of the city wall and watched the army of 20,000 gradually leave. A trace of worry appeared on his face. He murmured, "This time, all the cities of Nanzhou and Lin province have sent out their guards. The city defenses are empty. If the traitors take advantage of this weakness to invade, what should we do?" An official beside him smiled and said, "Lord Provincial Governor, you worry too much. Those traitors are nothing more than a motley crew. They are just showing off their might outside the capital. How would they have the guts to attack the capital? What's more, the largest group of traitors in the East only has a little more than 1,000 people. With how sturdy the capital is, without 50,000 soldiers, how could they easily break through?" The official looked down and said, "Unless the city gates can be opened from the inside. Even so, we can't let our guard down." The provincial governor of Nanzhou nodded and said, "Even if that Song province is breached from the inside, we can't let our guard down. In the next few days, have people step up the patrols. Send more people to the city gates to guard against those traitors." This lowly official understands. Although Nanzhou was not located in the hinterland of the Wu Kingdom, it was not as remote as Song province. The lives of the common people were slightly better. At the city gates, the army of 20,000 had just set out. The common people had retreated severally. Only after they had left did the city gates return to their usual order. Pedestrians and peddlers poured in from outside the city, appearing somewhat disorderly. After being reprimanded by the guards at the city gates, they obediently lined up and entered the city in order. When a man carrying firewood entered the city gates, he accidentally tripped. The firewood on his back scattered all over the ground. He hurriedly bent down to pick it up. "Do you know how to walk? Hurry up and pick it up. Don't block the way." A guard walked over while cursing. He bent down to help him pick up the firewood. The man revealed a grateful expression. He grasped the guard's hand and said, "Thank you, big brother official. If you're done, hurry up and go. There's still people waiting behind you." The official waved his hand and turned to leave. After the man carrying the firewood left, the city gates returned to normal order. The official returned to his original position. He tilted his head slightly and met the gaze of his comrade beside him. He moved half a step to the side and handed a piece of paper to him from behind. East of Nanzhou, in a certain mountain, ever since the collapse of the Wu Kingdom, heroes had risen. Some are powerful enough to occupy a city or a province. The weaker ones could only occupy a small county and were easily exterminated by the imperial court. Thus, most people had no hope of occupying a city and could only become roving bandits, plundering everywhere. In this mountain forest east of Nanzhou, there was a force of about 1,000 people. Relying on the advantage of the terrain, they had withstood the encirclement and suppression of the government several times. After taking root here, they became the largest group of bandits in the vicinity of Nanzhou. The leader of this group of bandits called himself the Roaming King. His name was extremely resounding in the vicinity of Nanzhou, enough to stop children from crying at night. But at this moment, this Roaming King, who was also a well-known figure in the eyes of the Nanzhou government, did not seem like the king of a mountain at all. With a flattering expression, he looked at the young woman sitting above and asked, "Big sister, the garrison of Nanzhou has just set off. The city is empty. What do we make our move?" Chapter 1092. Spread the word. Nanzhou, Yinzhou, Linzhou, Huazhou, and Tongzhou will seize the city at the same time in 3 days. Wu Chuang couldn't help but shiver when he heard the young lady's voice. Nanzhou's governor had just left with the garrison of the 5 states, but someone had already set their eyes on the state capital. If the city gates were opened, he could easily sweep away the remaining soldiers in the state capital with a few hundred of his brothers. Not to mention that there were so many powerful people around. It would be fine if these 20,000 people won Songzhou, but if they lost, they wouldn't even be able to return home. Without rations, they wouldn't be able to enter their homes, and there were pursuers behind them. The only path left was to be annihilated. From what this big sister said, it seemed that the small and medium-sized forces around Yinzhou, Linzhou, and Huazhou were also under their control. This time they would seize 5 states. Within the borders of the Wu Kingdom, there were dozens of smoke and dust clouds, but there had never been a rebel king who could occupy 5 states at the same time. He quickly recovered from his shock and said loudly, "I'll arrange it right away." With that, he quickly left. He had gathered so many brothers, thinking that it would only be a small fight and loot during the chaos. He didn't expect it to be so big this time, and he was even a little excited and expectant. Those people would attack Princess Duanrong, and when the sandpiper and the clam fought, they would be the fishermen who reaped the benefits. By Sue walked in from outside and looked at Mississippi Liu. He asked, "Alliance leader, there are 20,000 people attacking Songzhou this time. Can Jiang of Silla and the others handle it?" Mississippi Liu stood up and said, "Even if there are 200,000 of them, as long as he says he can handle it, then he can handle it." Baisu looked at her, and his lips moved, but he didn't say anything else. The alliance leader always had a kind of unreasonable confidence in Jiang of Silla. She sighed inwardly. When a woman liked a man, she would lose her judgment and think that whatever he did was right. Even extraordinary women like the alliance leader couldn't avoid this. She puffed out her chest out of habit. She could feel the pressure and restraint from him. She felt that King Jing was trustworthy most of the time. Nanzhou, Linzhou, Tongzhou, and other places were all part of the northwest of the Wu Kingdom. They were lower-middle prefectures, and the common people lived in poverty. Among them, Sangzhou was the worst. Sangzhou was located in the northwest of the Wu Kingdom and was the closest to the French. It used to be the most chaotic and impoverished place in the Wu Kingdom, but that was only in the past. Things were different now. The people of the other provinces had heard a little about Sangzhou's current situation. The bandits near Tsang Prefecture had been wiped out by Princess Duanrong, and the common people were no longer troubled by the bandits. The rich families who had caused trouble for the common people in Sangzhou City were also purged one by one. The government offices of the various counties were thoroughly cleaned up. If the common people had any grievances, they could appeal at any time. In addition, Princess Duanrong also provided the poor commoners with the opportunity to work and reduce taxes. If someone volunteered to join the army, they would receive a generous compensation. It was truly a case of one person joining the army. The whole family would not have to starve. On the other hand, even if they hid in the prefectural city, they would often be bullied by ruffians and bullies. If they lived outside the prefectural city, it would be even more precarious. Every day they could live was a day of gain. Not only did the poor commoners suffer from the bullying of the rich families, but the government's tax system was also exceptionally strict. Every few days, there would be additional reasons to tax the common people. The common people were suffering unspeakably, but they had no one to complain to. 2 years ago, when Princess Duanrong had taken over Sangzhou, they had already envied the lives of the common people in Sangzhou. After 2 years, Princess Duanrong had made a comeback, and their lives were even worse than those of the common people in Sangzhou. This time, the governor had led 20,000 soldiers to attack Sangzhou. Although they didn't know what the outcome would be, many of the common people even hoped that they would be defeated. Princess Duanrong would then take advantage of the victory to pursue them and take over Nanzhou and Linzhou. Their lives would be 10 or even 100 times better than their current lives. At night, at the eastern city gate of Nanzhou's prefectural city, all of you keep your spirits up. The provincial governor has ordered that if anything goes wrong in the next few days, be careful of your heads. When a military officer passed by the city gate, he gave a few words of warning to a group of guards before turning to leave. A guard curled his lips and muttered, "Why is he so fierce?" He married his sister to the governor as the 7th concubine to obtain such a position. A vile person intoxicated by success, a person beside him reminded, "Be quiet. If he hears you, you won't be able to bear the consequences. We haven't been paid for a few months. Our family is almost starving. When will these days end?" The guard leaned against the wall and yawned. He sighed and said, "I hope that Her Highness the Princess can fight her way in. Yesterday, I heard from the people outside that if one follows the princess as a soldier, they will immediately receive silver. 1 tael of silver. If they live frugally, they can ensure that their family won't starve for half a year." The person beside him was silent for a moment before asking, "You really want to follow Her Highness the Princess?" The guard shook his head and said, "AI, it's a pity that we are not fated to be in Sangzhou. We have no chance, dong, dong, dong." In the distance, the sound of the night watch could be heard. 1 slow, 2 fast, 3 times. It's the 3rd night. The person beside him heard the sound of the night watch. He turned his head and grinned at him, asking, "Do you want to be a soldier under the princess?" The 3rd night watch. It was already midnight. In Nanzhou City, apart from the night watchman and the occasional patrolling soldiers, the majority of the people had entered into a deep sleep. Countless silhouettes quietly appeared outside the East City Gate. Wu Chuang looked at the bald man in the lead, knocking on the city gate, as if he was knocking on his own door. The corner of his mouth couldn't help but twitch. This was the city gate. If the city gate could be so easily knocked on, then what was the use of building such a thick and solid city wall? However, his expression froze the next moment. After the bald man knocked on the gate, the city gate of Nanzhou City really did open a crack. Moreover, it opened wider and wider. At the same time, the city gates of Yinzhou, Linzhou, Huazhou, and Tongzhou all opened at the same time. Countless figures poured in from outside the city and went straight to the various government offices in the city. At the same time, in the camp of the Allied army of the 5 states that had been marching for 3 days, there was suddenly a chaotic sound of footsteps and fierce shouts. Fire! The provisions are on fire! Enemy attack! Enemy attack! Meet the enemy quickly! Put out the fire first! Save the provisions first! In the camp, there was a commotion. In a forest several miles away from the camp, a young man looked at the old man in front of him, shook his head, and said regretfully, "It's a pity that we can't find their commander's tent. Otherwise, with Sue's help, there would be no need to fight this battle." Someone beside him looked at him and said, "Their commander-in-chief is not that stupid to set up his tent in a place you can find. His Highness has already said that our mission is to burn down their rations. Once we complete our mission, we just need to go back and report. Don't make any more trouble. Sigh, whatever. Let's pack up and pack up." More than 10 Heaven List experts quickly disappeared into the dense forest. In the camp at the back, a man wearing ordinary armor asked with a gloomy expression, "How much is left?" A general knelt on the ground, raised his head to look at him, swallowed a mouthful of saliva, and said, "They used kerosene. More than half of the provisions have been burned. What is saved is probably only enough for the entire army to eat for half a day." The man clenched his fists, gritted his teeth, and said, "Outside Sangzhou, fortify the walls and clear the fields. From here to Sangzhou, there are still 2 days of journey, at least 1 day, and the provisions can only last for half a day. Tell me, how should we fight this battle?" The general thought for a moment and said in a low voice, "If we send people back to transport the provisions, it will take at least 4 days to go back and forth. If we march urgently, we can reach Sangzhou in 1 day. If we save some of the provisions, it will be enough to last for 2 days. If we can take down Sangzhou in one go, we will have enough provisions," the middle-aged man said coldly. "What if we can't do it in one go?" The general said in a low voice, "General, there's a great disparity in military strength between Sangzhou and us. We can definitely take down Sangzhou quickly. If we return now, I'm afraid our morale will be greatly affected, and it will be very disadvantageous." The middle-aged man thought for a moment, and after a moment he said in a low voice, "Just in case, send 2,000 people back to transport the provisions and follow me to attack Sangzhou in one go." Chapter 1093. Li Duan had been practicing diligently these 2 days because Rui had given him a task before he left. According to the agreed time, Nanzhou, Yinzhou, and the other 5 provinces should have fallen into her hands by now. The 20,000 soldiers led by the governor of Nanzhou had to attack the impregnable Sangzhou and retreat to attack the 5 provinces. They could only run around like children without their mothers. It was truly pitiful. What was even more pitiful was that they still did not know this. Li Duan was also quite pitiful. After Rui left, he completely let himself go and neglected his practice. Now that Rui was about to return, he only knew how to be anxious. Su had led people deep into the front lines last night and burned the enemy's rations. The people south of Sangzhou had all moved to the north of the city. They could not scavenge any food from the outside. There were 3 paths in front of them. The first was to return the way they came. If they were fast, they could return to Nanzhou in about 2 days. If they could take back Nanzhou from Mississippi Lu, the food crisis could be solved. The second was to send some people back to forcibly collect rations. They would wait in place, waiting for those who would never return, waiting for them to starve to death. The last path was to go all out and take down Sangzhou in one go. The rations in Sangzhou were piled up like mountains, so they naturally did not have to worry about food. They would know which path they had chosen in half a day at most. Of course, what Li Yi hoped for was naturally not to waste a single soldier, not to waste a single divine punishment, and not to waste a single artillery shell. No matter how disparate the strength of the 2 armies was, once the battle began, casualties were inevitable. Yang Luqing had already donned her armor. She looked a little valiant, without losing her heroic spirit. In these few years, she had completely transformed from the young girl who only knew how to follow behind Mississippi Lu in the 2nd year of Jinghe into her current self. She had transformed into the princess of a country, the ruler of a country. "Uncle Master," She walked to Li Yi's side and nodded slightly. This was probably the greatest battle she had ever experienced in her life. Li nodded and asked, "Are you nervous?" She looked up with a smile and said, "Not nervous. Fearless in the face of danger, unflinching even if Mount Tai collapsed before her." As expected of his martial niece, she had some of his demeanor. Yang Liuqing sat opposite him and asked, "After this battle, will Uncle Master go back?" Li Yi nodded. He had previously told Yang Liuqing that he and Rui would leave after they had completely established a foothold in the northwest. After conquering the 6 provinces for a long time to come, what they needed to do was not to continue attacking all the way to the imperial capital of the Wu country. Instead, they needed to rest and recuperate, gradually nibbling away at the outside world and slowly accumulate their strength so that they could gain a foothold here. This period of time could be 1 year, or it could be 2 years. Once this stage was over, what followed next would be an irresistible force that could sweep away all obstacles. Of course, everything was subject to change. It was possible that in the following period of time, the emperor of the kingdom might choke to death while eating, fall to death while walking, or be crushed to death by a meteorite falling from the sky. In this way, as the only legitimate member of the royal family of the kingdom, things would be much easier for her to handle. Of course, the probability of this happening was too small. The emperor of the kingdom was now completely frightened. He holed up in the imperial palace and refused to come out. Wherever he went, he had to bring countless guards and imperial guards with him. Even if a few grandmasters joined forces, they could not do anything to him. Li Yi thought about it carefully and realized that he seemed to have done something stupid. He had forcibly disrupted Emperor Wu's personal expedition. If he had come to conquer Cangzhou personally, Li Yi would have opened the city gates of Cangzhou to welcome him. Unfortunately, there was no medicine for regret in this world. Seeing that she seemed to have something to say, Li shook his head and said, "Uncle Master has done everything he could. You have to walk the road ahead on your own." "I understand." She nodded and looked at Li Yi. She wanted to say something, but stopped herself. At this moment, a general strode into the courtyard and handed over a secret letter. He said loudly, "Your Highness, the enemy is already 30 miles away from Cangzhou City." They had reached 30 miles away from Cangzhou City so quickly. This meant that Su had burned their food yesterday, and there was not much left. Otherwise, they would not be so anxious. Li Yi patted her on the shoulder and said, "Go ahead." The tense atmosphere in Cangzhou City reached its peak at a certain moment. The commoners in the city watched the rows of soldiers shuttling through the city. They could not help but feel their hearts in their throats. This battle would determine how they would survive in the future. It was closely related to their survival. 30 miles, 15 miles, 10 miles, 5 miles, 5 miles away from Cangzhou City. A deputy general looked at a thin line in the distance. That was the city wall of Cangzhou City. He urged his horse to the front and asked, "General Pang, should we let the soldiers rest here first?" They had already traveled for half a day and were exhausted. It was not wise to attack the city at this time. The best-case scenario would be for the army to camp and rest for the night when they were 30 miles away from Cangzhou City. However, they had already used up all of their food supplies. They could not afford to delay for too long. "Rest here for an hour." The general nodded and said, "Prepare the siege weapons. We will attack the city in an hour." "Roger." The deputy general turned his horse around and said loudly, "Rest here. We will attack the city in an hour." On Cangzhou City's city wall, Chen Qing was holding a pair of binoculars in his hand. He muttered, "Why did they stop?" General Fan stood beside him. He turned his head to look and asked, "Are the red barbarian cannons ready?" A person beside him immediately replied, "General, all 100 red barbarian cannons have been loaded." General Fan was relieved. He thought for a moment and said, "Just in case, check again, outside the city." The deputy general looked ahead and walked to the general's side. He asked doubtfully, "General Pang, why haven't they made a move?" General Pang looked ahead and asked, "How many soldiers are guarding Cangzhou City? Do they dare to leave the city to fight?" The deputy general nodded and said, "General, it's time." General Pang waved his hand and said, "Attack the city! Attack the city! Attack the city!" The general gave the order, and the army rushed forward. 5 miles, 3 miles, 2 miles. When Sangzhou City's city wall could be seen clearly, the deputy general's expression changed, and he said anxiously, "General, they still haven't left the city. They haven't even pulled up the drawbridge. Could it be a trap?" Just as he said that, he heard a cry of surprise. "What is that?" He looked up and saw countless black dots landing on the army camp. Boom, boom. Following that, he heard a series of deafening explosions. Soil flew everywhere and wails of pain could be heard. Following that, he couldn't even hear the deafening explosions anymore. All he could hear was a buzzing sound. In the army formation, the war horses neighed and raised their front hooves. They were in a mess and ran amok. Cavalrymen fell from their horses and were trampled on before they could get up. The entire battle formation was destroyed by the deafening explosion. The war horses neighed in fear and ran amok. After every deafening explosion, dozens of people fell. The fire and the deafening explosions caught them off guard. Divine punishment. This is divine punishment. A deputy general looked up and his eyes were filled with despair. This was the Jing Kingdom's divine punishment. No, it was enough to destroy their army formation from so far away. Even divine punishment did not have such power. "Retreat, retreat quickly." Just as he shouted, he lowered his head and looked at the long saber that had pierced through his chest. He looked at General Pang in disbelief, and his head tilted to the side. For disturbing the morale of the army, they should be killed. General Pang gritted his teeth and said loudly, "This is a long-range attack. Once we reach the city wall, they can't do anything. Attack the city." Under the command of the general, the morale of the army quickly stabilized, and they quickly approached the city wall. The drawbridge under the city wall had already been pulled up. As they approached, more stones and logs fell from above. The soldiers who were approaching the city wall threw sandbags into the moat and pushed the bodies of the people beside them into the moat. Soon, they reached the bottom of the city wall and were greeted by rolling stones and logs falling from the sky. In just a short distance of 2 miles, thousands of the 20,000 soldiers had died. However, they couldn't retreat. If they couldn't take down Sangzhou today, they would starve to death. Scaling ladders. Scaling ladders. Crash. Crash. Follow. Archers. Archers cover. Wei Liang waved his hand as he looked at the densely packed crowd below the city wall. Black balls were thrown down from the city wall one after another. Boom. 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 A series of deafening explosions and bursting flames wiped out all the enemies below the city wall. General Pang stood in the distance and looked at the towering city wall. His heart fell into a bottomless abyss. Chapter 1094. "Dad, what's going on outside?" Li Duan, who was practicing martial arts, ran over and asked Li Yi when he heard the deafening noise outside. Li picked him up and put him on his lap. "Outside, firecrackers are being set off outside." "Firecrackers?" Li Duan's eyes lit up. "Dad, I want to see firecrackers too." Li did not mind taking his child around when he was still young to see the world, but the bloody and cruel scene outside Sangzhou City would leave a lingering shadow in his heart, not to mention Li Duan. He touched Li Duan's head and smiled. "Go if you want to see it. Let Grandpa, Sue take you there. Remember to come back early. Your aunt will be back in a few days. She's been away for so long. Dwayner must miss her, right?" Li Duan jumped down from his lap and said seriously, "Dad, I don't want to see firecrackers anymore. Dwayner is a man, and a man must practice martial arts well. When Xiaomu grows up, I can protect her and not let her be bullied. I still have to protect Xiaorui, Xiaonyang, and many, many people. I can't relax. Dad, I'm going to practice." He watched him walk back to the yard and set up a fighting stance. His punches and kicks already had a little bit of momentum. Although he was everyone's baby since he was young, no one, including Rui, spoiled him. The 3-year-old Li Duan was more obedient and sensible than the 13-year-old Yang Fu. Li was deeply gratified. He turned his head and looked outside. The sounds of explosions were still rising and falling. As long as the weather allowed, this thing was an unparalleled weapon, whether it was used to attack or defend a city. Unless there was a huge disparity in the number of people, they would have to sacrifice their lives. 20,000 against 10,000. If they didn't meet a godlike commander, there was almost no chance of victory. Obviously, the enemy's commander was not so smart to choose to use half a day to catch up and immediately attack the city without provisions. On the city wall, General Fan rubbed his hands and said, "Damn it, I've been fighting wars for 20 years, but I didn't know that wars could be fought like this. As long as I stand on the city wall and throw stones, the enemies will come wave after wave to die. Isn't this like harvesting chives?" Wei Liang looked down and saw that the enemy had already retreated. He ordered his men, "Check the casualties and take a break." Although the soldiers did not leave the city, there were still people who were injured by the arrows and stones of the enemy. Of course, compared to the thousands of casualties of the enemy, their losses were almost negligible. More than 10,000 people temporarily set up camp 5 miles away from Sangzhou's capital. The atmosphere in the camp was gloomy. "General Pang, they have the Jing Kingdom's Tian Fa. We can't win. What should we do?" A deputy general had just opened his mouth to speak when he recalled the deputy general who had been sacrificed by General Pang for damaging their morale and immediately changed his words. General Pang thought for a moment, then said with a gloomy face, "Rest for half an hour, then launched the second attack." Originally, they thought that Sangzhou was still the original Sangzhou. With 20,000 soldiers, they could easily break through the broken city wall and march straight in. However, the enemy had built such a strong city wall in such a short time, and they even had the Jing Kingdom's Tian Fa divine weapon, but they could not retreat. Without food, they had no way of retreat. They could only advance, not retreat. If they advanced, they might have a chance of survival, but if they retreated, they would die. The deputy general walked out of the tent and said loudly, "Everyone, rest and reorganize. We will launch the second attack in half an hour." On top of the city wall, General Fan looked at the approaching enemy. He quickly finished a steamed bun with meat in his hand and shouted, "Prepare to meet the enemy." A moment later, he looked at the enemies who were focused on attacking the city gate. A cold smile appeared on his face, and he waved his hand, "Throw." Below at the city gate, thunder boomed, and with every boom, someone would fall. Every time someone fell, someone else would stand up from behind and forcefully smash a thick and solid tree against the city gate, giving off a muffled sound. Attack the city with all your might. Once the city gate is open, we will win. Crazed expressions appeared on their faces as they hit the gate again and again. Under their attacks, the city gate shook violently. The person at the front had an excited look on his face. He shouted, "The city gate is going to break soon. Use more strength. Use more strength." Boom, boom. Dozens of people hugged the huge log and slammed it against the city gate. The thick and heavy city gate could not withstand such a powerful impact and creaked. Finally, after a series of collisions, the huge log directly smashed through the city gates, and the 2 city gates collapsed with a loud rumble. Then they saw the city wall behind the city gate. The person at the front rushed in excitedly and hit the thick city wall, and his head was bleeding. He raised his head and touched the blood on his forehead. He looked at the city wall in front of him, his eyes empty. Damn it! He collapsed to the ground as if all the energy in his body had been sucked out. City gate, city gate. They actually built the city gate. Who was the general guarding Sangzhou? Who made the decision to build the city gate? Was he a pig? For an army, the ability to attack was very important. Very important. If the city gate was sealed, although the enemy could not enter, they could not come out either. The enemy could pile up soil to make watchtowers and use the watchtowers that were higher than the city wall to suppress the archers on the city wall. Then, they could dig through the city wall and enter the city, The enemy could also go around the city and attack the rear, leaving only a small group of elite soldiers to monitor. There is no more stupid way to defend a city than to seal the city gate. Although Tsangzhou was already the northwestern city of the Wu Kingdom and had no rear, and although they only had one goal for this trip, and it was impossible to go around it, wouldn't they plan to counterattack by sealing the city gate? If the enemy did not counterattack, they would not be able to attack. If they could not attack, what would they eat? It was shameless enough to hide on the city wall and throw those terrifying things. Now, they even sealed the city gate. Were they still human? Thunder rumbled outside. With just a few of them, it was impossible to dig through the city wall. The leader held back tears and shouted, "Retreat, retreat!" On the city wall, seeing the enemy retreating for the second time, Wei Liang turned to look at General Fan and asked, "Where did you learn so many tricks? How sinister!" "You flatter me." General Fan cupped his hands humbly and said, "It's all because Jiang of Silla taught me well." Jiang of Silla said that the enemy has no food and can't fight their way in. They won't be able to hold out for more than a few days. Wei Liang nodded. As generals, he and Fan Xiao both knew that sealing the city gate was usually the thinking of those civil officials. It was the stupidest thing to do. However, Jiang of Silla had let them know that nothing was absolute. After Tsangzhou was the land of chaos. The enemy's goal was only Tsangzhou, so they would not go around it. They did not have enough people to exhaust Tsangzhou to death. Moreover, there were mountains of food in Tsangzhou City. It was enough to exhaust the enemy dozens of times over. From the beginning to the end, they only needed to stand on the city wall and throw divine punishment. They did not even need to go out and fight the enemy head-on. In a few days, the 20,000 soldiers outside. Now that there were only 10,000 soldiers left, they would be defeated without a fight. Outside Tsangzhou City, the army had retreated for 10 miles. General Pang sat in his tent, his eyes bloodshot. A deputy general opened the tent and walked in. He said in a low voice, "General, in the 2 attacks, our army suffered more than 6,000 casualties. There are still about 12,000 who are able to fight." After he finished, he looked up and said with difficulty, "General, our food has been used up." General Pang clenched his fists and loosened them after a while. He gritted his teeth and said, "Kill the horses." The deputy general's expression changed. "General, killing the horses can solve the emergency, but our cavalry will be crippled. If the enemy leaves the city, our combat power will be greatly reduced. Can't you see?" General Pang looked at him and asked, "They want to exhaust us to death. Pass down my order, surround Tsangzhou." His voice was gloomy as he said, "Wait until the food from the rear arrives, then send people to the other provinces to collect it. I want to see how long the food in their city can last them." Chapter 1095. The allied forces of Nanzhou, Linzhou, and the rest of the 5 states set up camp 10 li away from Tsangzhou City. They didn't dare to get too close. If they got too close, Wei Liang and the rest would let them have a taste of the Red Barbarian cannon. They also didn't dare to attack the city. The city gates were sealed. If they rushed to the bottom of the city walls, Sky Law would reap lives like harvesting chives. Logically speaking, after 2 attempts at sieging the city, they did not gain any advantage at all. In fact, they did not even touch the enemy, but they had already suffered such a huge loss. An ordinary army would have long lost their morale, and they would have been utterly defeated. Yet, the other party was still able to maintain their composure. Either the other party's morale was high, or the other party's commander was a little girl. Chun Qing saw their actions clearly with the high-powered binoculars on the city walls. Without food, the enemy's general was decisive. They killed the horses to eat. Although this action could temporarily solve the problem of hunger, it was equivalent to completely giving up on the cavalry. It seemed like they wanted to hold on until the reinforcements arrived. He really didn't have the heart to tell them that their reinforcements wouldn't be coming back. When they finished eating the horse meat and were dizzy from hunger and exhausted, General Wei would order the city gates to be opened. He would lead a new army that was full of energy and equipment to bombard them with Tion Fa and the Red Barbarian cannons to give them the final blow. The citizens of Sangzhou City could finally relax. Although when the enemy attacked the city, the rumbling outside made people panic, and the city was in chaos. But His Highness had won, and won so easily. In their hearts, they finally had confidence. Li Duan was also relieved. He had learned all the martial arts that Little Aunt taught him before she left. He wouldn't be spanked because he couldn't report back. At this time, it was already the third day of the Allied forces attacking the city. On top of the city wall, Wei Liang put away the binoculars and said, "They have eaten all their horses. This morning, they started digging wild vegetables to fill their stomachs. Let's starve them for another 3 days. 3 days later, we will go out of the city to meet the enemy." General Fan curled his lips. "Meet my ass. If they still have the strength to hold weapons after 3 days, I will be convinced." He walked to the edge of the city wall and said, "It's about time. Release it." "Yes." A few guards responded and lowered a huge curtain made of cloth from the city wall. Not long after, a horse galloped into the barracks outside the city. A moment later, a deputy general walked into the main tent and said in a deep voice, "General Peng, a scout just came back and said that they wrote on the city wall." The middle-aged man frowned. "What word?" The deputy general opened his mouth and said with difficulty, "Those who surrender will not be killed." General Peng slammed the table and roared, "Bastard! General, we've run out of rations. The soldiers haven't eaten well these past few days. Many of them are vomiting and having diarrhea. Why haven't the people who went to transport the rations returned?" A gloomy expression appeared on General Peng's face as he said, "I've already sent people to investigate. There will be news in at most 2 days, but the soldiers can't wait another 2 days. Since yesterday, hundreds of deserters have appeared." The deputy general looked at him and murmured, "General, let's retreat. Sangzhou is no longer the Sangzhou of the past. We can't take it, Clang." General Peng pulled out a long saber hanging at the side and placed it on the deputy general's neck. He glared at him and said angrily, "Say that again, and I will behead you for disturbing the morale of the army." The deputy general's face turned pale and immediately said, "Please forgive me, General." General Peng removed the long saber from the deputy general's neck and said, "Pass down the order. Tonight at midnight, we will launch a surprise attack on Sangzhou." "Yes." The deputy general walked out of the tent and wiped the trace of blood on his neck. His face was slightly gloomy. Outside the tent, the patrolling soldiers were pale and moved slowly. As they patrolled, the weapons in their hands fell to the ground, and they bent down to pick them up with great effort. They looked weak and lifeless like zombies. Cries of anguish could be heard from the various tents. These days, it had been nonstop. In a certain tent, dozens of people were gathered together. Their faces were sallow and emaciated. One of them gulped and said weakly, "What is the general thinking? There's clearly no more rations. Why aren't we retreating?" As soon as the words came out, several voices immediately came from the tent. "Yes, I told them 3 days ago that the troops escorting the rations will arrive soon. It's been 3 days, and the wild vegetables and tree barks near the camp have all been eaten up. Why haven't they arrived yet? Didn't Brother Chi say that he saw with his own eyes that a banner was hung on Sangzhou's city wall saying that those who surrender will not be killed and there will be meat to eat? Those who surrender will be given military merits. Is there really such a thing? Shut up." A person walked in from outside the tent and shouted angrily. The people in the tent shuddered and shrunk their heads back. They whispered, "General, discussing defecting in the army was a capital offense." Just like those deserters, their heads were hung in front of the formation after they were captured. If they were not the general's personal guards, they would have already knelt and begged for mercy. The deputy general looked at them and said, "Who gave you the guts to discuss this in the tent?" "General, we are wrong." The few of them knelt on the ground and said in unison. The deputy general stood where he was and looked at them. After a while, he said, "Chi-san, come with me." The scout called Chi-san was called to another tent. The people in the tent looked at each other with flickering eyes. A short while later, the scout called Chi San returned to his tent. Another hour passed, and the rest of the people walked out of their tents and entered the other tents. On the city walls of the Sangzhou's capital, Wei Liang received an arrow from a soldier and removed a paper tube from the end of the arrow. A smile appeared on his face as he tossed it to General Fan beside him. They wanted to send people over at midnight to secretly break through the city wall. What good idea. General Fan pursed his lips and said, "Tell the brothers to perk up for this general tonight." It was midnight. The moon was dark and the wind was strong. There were no stars in the night sky. The entire city of Sangzhou was shrouded in darkness. Outside the city walls, a black shadow was slowly approaching the city walls. Even heavens are helping me. Behind the crowd, General Pang looked at the pitch-black night and ordered, after entering the city, think of every way possible to hollow out the city wall. The others will cover the attack. Gulp. Suddenly, a strange sound was heard. A person beside him held his stomach and whispered, "General, I'm sorry, I can't control my stomach." General Pang frowned and glared at his personal guard. "Bear with it for a while more. When we enter the city, you can eat as much as you want." As soon as he finished speaking, a large fire suddenly lit up on the city wall. He was only stunned for a moment before he immediately said, "Attack the city." Poof! The sound of a sharp sword piercing into flesh could be heard. General Pang was very familiar with this sound. Just a few days ago, he had pierced his sword into the chest of the deputy general who had disturbed the morale of the army. At this moment, another deputy general stood behind him and whispered in his ear, "General, I'm sorry. His Majesty only wants you to live because you want to conquer Sangzhou. However, we also want to live. Only by following Her Highness can we live and have meat to eat." He slowly pulled out his sword and said, "So, General, please die." General Pang clutched his chest, the light in his eyes frozen. The deputy general threw down the blood-stained sword in his hand and said loudly, "General Pang is dead. We are willing to surrender." The hundreds of soldiers beside him put down their weapons and said in unison, "General Pang is dead. We are willing to surrender." Countless people in the distance stared at the people in front of them in a daze. They saw the group of people kneeling on the ground, and when they heard the words, "General Pang is dead," they were momentarily stunned before they put down their weapons and knelt on the ground. "We can't surrender. We can't surrender. You are committing treason." There were many different voices, but these voices did not last long before they were drowned out by the voices around them. Chapter 1096. Filling one's stomach and ensuring one's survival were the most basic requirements of a human being. The commander of the allied forces of the 5 provinces had already been killed by the rebellious deputy general. No one knew what he was thinking. As the commander, he had actually committed such a grave mistake. Under the circumstances where the entire army couldn't fill their stomachs, he still gave the order to attack the city even at the cost of his life. When Wei Liang and the others left the city to receive the rebels, they didn't encounter much resistance. Those who resisted were all taken down by their comrades. Over 10,000 people consumed a lot of rations every day. However, Yang Liuqing couldn't bring herself to abuse captives. Fortunately, Sangzhou wasn't what it used to be. What they lacked the least was rations. For the time being, there wouldn't be a food crisis. Wei Liang and the others reorganized the surrendered soldiers in the shortest time possible and brought them out of Sangzhou. Nanzhou, Linzhou, and the other places were now in their hands. They had to bring these people back to defend as soon as possible to prevent any new changes. Up until now, Yang Liuqing and the others had already taken control of 6 provinces. The troops under their control had also reached more than 20,000. Sangzhou had already become the rear. Some people were left in Sangzhou, while the others had to head to Nanzhou and the other places that had already become the front lines. 20,000 troops wasn't a lot. The next step was to further expand the troops. They were already familiar with this. Under the attraction of the high benefits, in a few months, the troops in her hands would multiply. When Nanzhou and the other 4 provinces had completely settled down, she would also have a mighty army that could attack wherever she pointed, win every battle, and conquer every city. In an era where most countries still use cold weapons, as long as they didn't encounter the Jing kingdom that had the omniscient view, after some training, with heavenly punishment, cannons, flintlocks, and all kinds of firearms. They could sweep through everything in their way. Nanzhou, Linzhou, Yinzhou, Huazhou, and Tongzhou had fallen at the same time. The allied forces of the 5 provinces had suffered a crushing defeat in attacking Songzhou. The governor of Nanzhou had died, and the allied forces had been absorbed by Princess Duanrong. From then on, the forces led by Princess Duanrong had already occupied 6 provinces in the northwest of the Wu Kingdom, becoming a well-deserved hegemon. Once this news spread, it spread rapidly within the borders of the Wu Kingdom. Fuzhou. Fu Province was also located in the northwest of the Wu Kingdom, but unlike Nanzhou and other places, it wasn't under the jurisdiction of the imperial court. Several years ago, Emperor Wu had started a rebellion, killing his brother and father. After he ascended to the throne, the provincial governor of Fuzhou used the excuse that Emperor Wu had gone against the will of heaven to rebel against the imperial court. He called himself the Prince of Kong. Because Fuzhou had the advantage of the terrain, it was easy to defend and hard to attack. In the past few years, the imperial court had tried to encircle and suppress them several times, but to no avail. They had taken advantage of this opportunity to expand and strengthen themselves. Right now, they were one of the top powers in the northwestern region of the Wu Kingdom. Of course, he could only count to 3 now. At this time, the former provincial governor of Fuzhou, the current Prince of Kong, had lost his usual composure. He paced around the mansion until someone walked quickly into the hall. He immediately raised his head and asked anxiously, "Is there any mistake in the news? Did Princess Duanrong really seize 5 provinces and the allied forces of the 5 provinces were defeated?" The young man who walked in nodded and said solemnly, "Your Highness, we still don't know the specifics. However, including Nanzhou, the flags of Princess Duanrong have indeed been hung in the capitals of the 5 provinces." According to the news, right after the allied forces of the 5 provinces led by the governor of Nanzhou left, the capitals of the 5 provinces were seized by someone on the same night, and the government offices were taken over. We originally thought that it was the fishermen who reaped the benefits when the sandpiper and the clam fought. However, we didn't expect that both the sandpiper and the fishermen were actually Princess Duanrong's people. Prince of Kong was silent for a moment and asked again, "Rumor has it that Princess Duanrong has Tian Fa of the Jing Kingdom. Is this news true or false?" "This news has not been confirmed yet." The young man pondered for a moment and said slowly, "I only heard that when the allied forces of the 5 provinces were 2 li away from the capital of Songzhou, a meteorite fell into the army camp. Its power was not weaker than Tian Fa of the Jing Kingdom. As a result, the allied forces suffered heavy casualties. And when they attacked the city, the thunderous roars could be clearly heard from more than 10 li away. Then it should be true," Prince of Kong murmured. "Could it be that Princess Duanrong has defected to the Jing Kingdom?" His face was filled with uncertainty. Fuzhou was not far from Nanzhou and other places. If they pushed forward, they would soon reach the city of Fuzhou. He was confident that he could withstand the attack of the imperial court, but not the Jing Kingdom's Tian Fa. Prince of Kong thought for a moment and revealed a worried expression. "Let's wait and see for now." Spiritual state. The faces of the provincial governor of spiritual state, the governor, and the important officials of the state were filled with fear. They really conquered 5 provinces. Hurry, send a message to the capital. Spiritual state is in danger. In a conquered province in the south of the Wu Kingdom, a few famous rebellious kings had gathered together. Princess Duanrong is making a comeback. Songzhou, Nanzhou, Linzhou, they actually conquered 6 provinces. If we wait until they grow up, won't they become obstacles on our path to greatness? The Wu Kingdom was already a pool of turbulent waters. What Princess Duanrong did in the northwest was like a huge stone thrown into the water, creating waves that could stir up the entire Wu Kingdom. In the northwest, both the officials and the rebels were panicking. They were worried that they would become the next Nanzhou. In other places, their vigilance toward Princess Duanrong increased by several levels. In the imperial study deep in the palace of the capital, several eunuchs and palace maids knelt on the ground with their heads lowered, shivering. The Force Emperor had smashed the imperial study into a mess. He had pushed down the bookshelves and overturned the tables and chairs, but he was still angry. After kicking over several eunuchs and palace maids, he roared hoarsely with blood-red eyes, "Useless! All of you are useless! 5 provinces can't conquer one Sangzhou. What's the use of raising these useless people?" His face was full of anger, but few people could see a trace of deep fear hidden behind the anger. He picked up the overturned chair and sat on it, panting heavily. "Come, Your Majesty." A eunuch walked in from outside the palace and bowed slightly to the Force Emperor. "Sent an urgent message from 800 miles away. Inform all the relay stations that if they meet that female senior." He let out a sigh and said, "Tell her that I already have news of that Su Tian. As long as she helps me kill Princess Duanrong, I will tell her where Su Tian is." The eunuch looked up at the Force Emperor and said in a low voice, "But Your Majesty, we don't know where the person she's looking for is. I'm the Emperor, the ruler of a country. She's also a citizen of the Wu Kingdom. What's wrong with me telling her to kill someone? Does she have a right to bargain with me?" Looking at the Force Emperor, who had suddenly become furious, the eunuch lowered his head and said in a low voice, "As you command." After Yang Liuqing and the others seized these provinces, the officials of the Wu Kingdom near Nanzhou didn't make any moves. However, the major rebel forces in the area all sent people over to express their goodwill. They were afraid that Yang Liuqing's next move would be to point their cannons at them. In fact, this was completely unnecessary. They had just taken over such a large area and didn't even have enough time to govern and expand their organization. They didn't have the time to pay attention to them, and they didn't need to express their goodwill. When a matter here was over and the 6 provinces, including Sangzhou, Nanzhou, were united, they didn't need to express their goodwill. Sooner or later, they would use cannons to blast open their city gates, of course. One wouldn't slap a smiling person. Even if they were enemies, they couldn't turn hostile at this time. Wei Liang and the others even brought the envoys sent by the various forces to watch a military exercise. Tian Fa cannons were fired. It was said that when they saw the red barbarian cannon blast 2 li away and raze a house to the ground, some people couldn't even stand properly on the spot. If they didn't need to use force or cannon to blast open their city gates, it would naturally be best if they could take the initiative to surrender. Rui had returned 2 days ago. They used the same method they used on the bandits in the Bedlam lands to purge all the bandits in the 5 provinces. They didn't have to worry about the security of the 5 provinces in the future. But after they left, they had to pay extra attention to the safety of Yang Liuqing. If something happened to her, then everything they had done before would be meaningless. After a period of time, Rui would leave with him. Su definitely wouldn't be willing to stay. She still had the experts from the Lu League by her side, and her own strength wasn't weak either. As long as the other party wasn't a grandmaster, there wouldn't be too much of a problem. Although the possibility of meeting a grandmaster was too small, it was better to be safe than sorry. He walked out of the courtyard and looked up at the sky. How good would it be if a grandmaster could fall from the sky and stay by her side to protect her? In a certain province of the Wu Kingdom, an old man with white hair and beard was riding on a horse. There was a faint trace of worry on his face. He clamped the horse's belly tightly and shook the reins. There was only a trail of smoke left on the official road. The smoke was pointing in the direction of Sangzhou. Chapter 1097. According to Li Yi's plan to nurture an empress, after they took over the 5 prefectures, they shouldn't be in a hurry to expand. Instead, They should focus on construction first and forge the 6 prefectures in the northwest into an impregnable fortress. Then, even if they were to go against the imperial court's army, they would have the confidence to contend against them. Unfortunately, things didn't go as planned. Chun Xing and Fan Xiao had led their troops to take over their new territory early in the morning. A few days ago, some of the major forces in the surrounding areas had sent people over. Wei Liang had kindly brought them to watch a military exercise to broaden their horizons. Who would have expected that the next day, the overlords of 3 prefectures would come to surrender and express their willingness to follow the princess to conquer the world? They had been lying low for many years and had endured for many years just to wait for such an opportunity. Perhaps they had betrayed the imperial court back then just to wait for such a wise ruler. Or perhaps it was because on the day of the military exercise, Wei Liang and the others weren't stingy at all. Dozens of red barbarian cannons fired at the same time and razed a section of Sangzhou's old city wall to the ground. Overnight, the forces that they could control in the northwest had increased by 3 more prefectures. In this way, the entire northwest of the Wu Kingdom had almost fallen into their hands. On top of that, all kinds of crushing firearms had already infiltrated the members of the holy religion in the prefectures and prefectures. It was no different from playing a game of landlord. They had already gotten 2 kings and 4 twos. If they lost such a good hand, it would really be God's will. Greetings, Your Highness. Greetings, Your Highness. Yang Liuking's popularity in Sangzhou had reached an unimaginable level. In the entire Sangzhou, there were many people who had set up longevity tablets for her. Along the way, many commoners who saw her directly knelt on the ground and kowtowed nonstop. Those who won the hearts of the people would win the world. If she wanted to be the empress, the commoners of Sangzhou would definitely not have any objections. Even now, there were still many commoners who came to the princess's residence to deliver things every day. Sometimes it was a handful of vegetables, and sometimes it was a few eggs. When they walked back, there were still a few people in front of the princess's mansion. They looked into the mansion, only wanting to see Her Highness's heavenly face. Seeing this, Li Yi was relieved. Lu Meng would continue to expand in the Wu Kingdom and temporarily move their headquarters to the Wu Kingdom. In the places they recovered, the brothels would also be gradually built to cooperate with her to unify the minds of the people. In terms of business, there would also be people in charge to drive the development of these areas. Only when the people had a rich life would they remember her kindness more and more. Now that she had gained a firm foothold here, it was time for Li Yi and Rui to leave. In front of the princess mansion, a guard looked at the woman in front of him who was carrying a child and said, "Sister-in-law, it's not that we don't want to accept it, but we have rules. We don't take a needle or thread from the commoners, not even an egg. If it weren't for you, the 2 of us would have long since died in the chaos. I don't have anything to repay you with, princess. I'll leave this basket of eggs for you to feel at ease." With that, the woman quietly put down the basket, picked up the child, and turned to leave. The 2 guards sighed. The people of Sangzhou really liked the princess. They had to experience such things dozens of times a day. Another white-haired old woman walked forward. She didn't have anything in her hand. She was probably here to try her luck and see the princess. A guard walked over and said, "Old lady, you should go back. Her Highness has just returned to the mansion. She probably won't leave today." The old woman looked up and asked, "Is Princess Duanrong inside?" The guard looked at her and thought that the old woman's hearing was bad, so he raised his voice and shouted, "Old lady, the princess has just returned. Come back tomorrow." The old woman glanced at him and said coldly, "You don't have to speak so loudly. No one thinks you're mute." After saying that, she turned around and left. The guard looked at her and felt that this old woman was different from other old women. She came here not to see the princess, but not to take an egg inside the princess's mansion. Although she was leaving with Rui and the others, there were some important things she had to tell Yang Liuking before she left. This was a small, independent courtyard. Li Yi sat with her at the stone table in the courtyard. He picked up a teacup and moistened his lips. He said, "Being supported by the people at the bottom is your advantage. However, it's far from enough. They can help you sit in that position, but they can't help you govern the country. In addition, you have to win the support of the scholars. Before Li Yi finished speaking, he looked up and saw an old woman walking into the courtyard. He stood up. The princess's mansion was heavily guarded. There were also many guards at the entrance of the small courtyard. Even Wei Liang and Chun Qing needed to be notified before they could enter. It was a strange thing for an unfamiliar old woman to appear here. In particular, she was just standing there casually, but she gave off an extremely dangerous feeling. The old woman walked into the courtyard and looked at Li Yi. She asked calmly, "Where is Princess Duanrong?" Yang Liuqing's back was facing the door. She was about to stand up when Li Yi walked to her side. He put his right hand on her shoulder and pressed it down. He asked the old woman, "Why are you looking for Her Royal Highness?" "Someone asked me to take her life," the old woman said lightly. Her figure flashed, and her speed increased sharply. She slapped Yang Liuqing. As soon as she opened her mouth, Li Yi had already grabbed Yang Liuqing's shoulder and pushed her to the side. He raised his hands and met the old woman's palm. He took a few steps back. There was a trace of surprise on his face. His chest felt uncomfortable. This old woman was even stronger than Rui. At this moment, the old woman had already turned her palm into a claw and was about to grab his neck. 2 years ago, Li Yi was already able to enter the top 20 of the heaven list. In these 2 years, because of the tortoise breathing skill, his strength increased every day. Every time he fought with Bai Su, who was already in the top 5 of the heaven list, he had a 50-50 chance of winning. But he still could not withstand a single move from this old woman. Even if she was not a grandmaster, she was extremely close. Facing her claw, Li Yi's expression was calm. He stood still. The old woman's body also stopped. One of her hands was already placed on the young man's neck, but she could not move an inch further. She could not use any strength, and it was extremely difficult to use her inner force. Beside her, the young woman's slender white hand was placed on the old woman's neck. She looked at her calmly and gently said 2 words. "Let go." The old woman released her hand from the young man's neck. The young woman also let go of her neck. 2 of her major acupoints had been sealed just now. At this moment, she could only use less than 10% of her peak kung fu. This 10% of her strength could not even compare to the young man in front of her, let alone the young grandmaster who had sealed her acupoints. The old woman was tied up by Bai Su, who had rushed over. Li looked at Rui with a puzzled expression. "Grandmaster?" Rui nodded. The high and mighty grandmasters in the past did not seem to be so powerful anymore. Li Yi suddenly had confidence. Perhaps in this lifetime, he could also touch this level. As if reading his thoughts, Rui shook her head and said, "She was injured, and it was not light. Otherwise, I would not have been able to subdue her so easily." Li was also a little hurt. He looked at the old woman and thought to himself that Su's words really could not be trusted. There were no other grandmasters in the Wu Kingdom, but this old woman was one. If it were not for Rui today, he and the future empress would have been in danger. Speaking of Su arrived. He was still outside, but his voice had already come from outside the door. "I heard that you have caught a grandmaster." "Let me see." He was holding a drumstick in his hand. He took a bite of it, held the drumstick in his mouth, and walked over quickly. Halfway there, his body suddenly stopped. His eyes widened and his mouth opened wide. The chicken drumstick he had bitten off fell to the ground. Then, his figure gradually faded in front of Li Yi's eyes and finally disappeared, leaving only the drumstick with one bite missing on the ground. Li Yi watched this scene with his eyes wide open until the residual figure disappeared. A grandmaster was so terrifying. Chapter 1098. As soon as Su stepped into the yard, he saw that the old woman, who was tied up by Bai Su, had disappeared without a trace. "Su Tian." Then, a harsh voice came into Li Yi's ears. The reason why it was harsh was that the voice contained too much resentment, surprise, disbelief, and some indescribable emotions. It was complicated and indescribable. The old woman's chest heaved, and her face turned from white to red and then to white. Puff! She suddenly spat out a mouthful of blood, and her face became paler. The rope tied around her was broken by her. As soon as Li Yi became vigilant, her body turned into a shadow and disappeared from his sight. Li Yi stared in the direction of the gate of the yard, and then looked at Rui. Rui shook her head and said, "She broke through her acupoints on her own, which greatly damaged her power and made her injury more serious. If she doesn't take good care of herself, she will never be able to return to the supreme power realm." Li knew what would happen if someone broke through their acupoints by force. When they were in Shuzhou, Rui also broke through her acupoints by force to save him. The result was that the heroine Mississippi Liu became even worse than an ordinary woman. She needed to be fed, carried to bed, and dressed. He took care of her meticulously for several months before she got better. The heart-wrenching Su Tian just now was still echoing in his ears. Just thinking about it made his hair stand on end, and he shuddered. With such heavy resentment, Su must have an irreconcilable feud with her. She didn't hesitate to break through her acupoints and destroy her own foundation to chase after him for revenge. Unfortunately, even if she was at her peak, she might not be a match for Su. Now that she was seriously injured, it was even more impossible. Li Yi held Rui's hand and walked out of the door. If they were too slow, they might miss an annual drama. It was very likely to be a drama with many twists and turns. Bai Su and Yang Liuqing looked at each other and quickly followed. Outside the princess palace, the old woman stood on the street and looked around. That person's figure was already gone. She seemed to be in a daze as she screamed, Su Tian, come out. You had the ability to do such a thing in the past. Why don't you have the ability to come out now? Come out." Outside of the princess's mansion, there were already many commoners gathered. At this moment, they were looking at the old woman in the middle of the road with astonishment and confusion. Li Yi held Rui's hand and stepped out of the princess mansion. The door of the princess residence was broken, and no one knew who did it. What did he do? Li Yi looked at the old woman who was on the verge of going crazy. Could it be that when Su was young, he also had a romantic debt? How could someone fall for someone like him? This old lady didn't seem to be blind, Xiao. A figure dashed over from afar and stopped 30 feet away from the old woman. It was a white-haired old man. His hair was messy and he looked travel-worn. He looked a little flustered. He looked around and saw the broken door of the princess residence. Then he looked at the old woman and said hoarsely, "You've already done it." The old woman didn't seem to see him. Her eyes were unfocused as she said hoarsely, "Su Tian, come out, come out. Crazy woman, what did you do to Qing?" In a rage, the white-haired old man's body swayed and appeared in front of the old woman. He pressed his palm on her shoulder. The old woman took a few steps back and spat out blood again. However, she didn't fight back. She just stood there and stared blankly in front of her. Li Yi looked at Rui. Before he could say anything, Rui nodded slightly and said, "Grandmaster." Su had once said that it was impossible to see a grandmaster here. In just a quarter of an hour, he had seen two. Strange Su was indeed Strange Su. His words couldn't be trusted easily. "Crazy woman, I won't argue with you for chasing me all the way here. But you harmed Qing. So I'll make you pay with your blood." On the long street, the old man looked at the old woman. His face was full of anger. He said in a stern voice and slapped the old woman's chest. Bang! This was not the sound of his angry slap landing on the old woman's body. Out of nowhere, a foot stretched out and kicked him in the chest. He flew backward and fell to the ground in a sorry state. He took a few steps back and patted his chest. When he looked up, he was suddenly stunned and said in shock, "Strange Su, why is it you?" Then he pointed at the old woman and said, "Quick, help me catch her. I have an irreconcilable hatred with this crazy woman. Don't let her escape." Su looked at him expressionlessly and said indifferently, "Get lost." The old man was stunned. Then his face became extremely ugly and he asked, "Su Tian, what do you mean by this?" Su ignored him and turned around to help the old woman tidy up her clothes. He carefully wiped the blood from the corner of her mouth and sighed. You might not be able to return to the Grandmaster realm for the rest of your life if you force your way through. Why bother? The old woman looked at him and said with a smile, I became a Grandmaster so that I can catch up to you one day. When I catch up to you, being a Grandmaster means nothing to me. He didn't expect that one day he would eat Sue's dog food. Indeed, one couldn't judge a book by its cover. Even the sloppiest person could show off dog food. The white-haired old man looked at the opposite side and said again, Sue, shut up. He glared at him. Sue, it's Sue. Don't you know how to read the situation? The old man patted the footprint on his chest, and his breathing became heavier. It had been a long time since someone had talked to him like this. If it weren't for the fact that he was still seriously injured, if it weren't for the young woman standing next to this kid, giving him an extremely dangerous feeling, if it weren't for the fact that he had not figured out the situation over there, he would definitely make this kid suffer. Right now, Imperial Uncle, a voice came from the front. When the old man looked up, he was startled and blurted out, Ching! Yang Liuqing walked out of the princess residence and saw the white-haired old man. She was surprised and happy and asked, Imperial Uncle, why are you here? The white-haired old man quickly walked over and looked at her. He asked, Ching, are you all right? Did that crazy woman do anything to you? No. Yang Liuqing shook her head. That's good. The old man let out a long sigh of relief and looked at Rui and Li. He asked, who are they? Yang Liuqing looked at Rui and Li and said, Uncle Master, this is my Imperial Uncle. Before I met Master, he was the one who taught me martial arts. Then she looked at the old man and introduced, Imperial Uncle, these are my Uncle Masters. You have a master? The old man frowned and looked at her. He asked, what about your other master? Is he also a Grandmaster? Yang Liuqing looked at Rui, who had just walked out of the residence, and introduced, Imperial Uncle, this is my master. With the old man's eyesight, he could naturally see that although the young woman in front of him had extraordinary strength, she had not reached the Grandmaster realm. Not a Grandmaster? The old man's frown deepened. If he's not a Grandmaster, what makes him qualified to be your master? When Li saw that Mississippi Lu had changed from hugging the sword to holding it, he knew that she was starting to get angry. Rui suddenly turned around and looked at Mississippi Lu. She said, this old man is seriously injured. Don't argue with him. Based on Li Yi's understanding of Rui, who had shared a bed with Mississippi Lu for many years, she did not want Mississippi Lu to suffer any grievances. Therefore, the meaning of her words could be put in another way. Rui, this old man is seriously injured. He's no match for you now. You can beat him up if you want. Based on his understanding of Mississippi Lu after sharing a bed with Mississippi Lu for one night, Mississippi Lu must have understood the deeper meaning behind Rui's words. Li had a tacit understanding with the two sisters. He caught the scabbard that Mississippi Lu threw at him like a lackey. However, a cold light suddenly appeared in the eyes of the white-haired old man. He was shocked and quickly retreated. He shouted angrily, what are you doing? Yang Liuqing's master. Mississippi Lu looked at him and hugged the sword. Lu Rui, please advise me. Chapter 1099. The old woman, who had an inexplicable relationship with Sue, was already seriously injured. Then, she forcefully opened her acupoints, which worsened her injuries. Later, she was hit by Yang Liuqing's Imperial Uncle, the white-haired old man, who was also a guru. Coupled with her emotional fluctuations, her body was almost at the end of its tether. Fortunately, both Rui and Sue had preserved their peak strength. The two gurus worked together to stabilize her injuries. She was still in a coma at the moment, but her life was no longer in danger. As for Yang Liuqing's Imperial Uncle, the white-haired old man named Yang Wanli, after giving advice to Rui, he looked even more disheveled. He came out after changing his clothes and said something to Yang Liuqing. Everyone who became a guru had their own martial arts. They would have different understandings after learning from different gurus. Rui seemed to have realized something again and hurried back to her room for closed-door training. In the past few years, Not only had Li Yi made rapid progress, but Rui had also been busy fighting for territory everywhere, but she had never neglected her practice. Unfortunately, she had not broken through that layer of window paper. Apart from Miss Rui, your second daughter's aptitude is the best I've seen in my life. Su's eyes were full of praise. He said, although she has not reached the guru level, a guru may not be able to do anything to her. Once she encounters her own opportunity and breaks through to the guru level, even I dare not say that I can defeat her easily. Opportunity was an illusory thing. You might encounter it tomorrow, or you might never encounter it again. It was as good as not saying anything. However, to be able to make Elder Su say that he didn't dare to say that he could defeat her easily, that was really impressive. One had to know that the Taoist nun was also a guru. In Elder Su's eyes, she was the kind of person who could be easily beaten up and taught a lesson. Li thought for a moment and asked, what about Mingzhu's aptitude? She has excellent aptitude, but her heart is tired. Su shook his head and said, if this goes on, my martial arts will not improve, and I won't have any hope of becoming a grandmaster in this life. Li Yi's heart ached. Mingzhu's dedication to martial arts was not inferior to Rui's. One of her biggest wishes was to become a grandmaster one day. But Li Xian, that bastard, had handed over such a big country to her to manage. How could she have the time to practice hard? However, there were also benefits to this. He was now able to fight evenly with Bai Su, who was ranked 5th on the heavenly list. If he took a step forward and Mingzhu took a step back, it would be equivalent to Mingzhu taking 2 steps back. After a while, when he returned to the capital city, wouldn't he be able to turn over a new leaf? It was not easy to become a grandmaster. It was not something that could be achieved through hard work. He now understood that sometimes chicken soup for the soul did not work. Those who could become grandmasters were people with excellent aptitude. This fact was actually very cruel. Some people were born to be grandmasters. Even a sloppy person like Su had amazing aptitude. Some people, no matter how hard they practiced, had limited aptitude and could only stop below the grandmaster level. Li looked at Su with some expectation and asked, what about my aptitude? You? Su looked at him and twitched the corner of his mouth. He. It was used to express mockery, disdain, perfunctory, end of chat, and awkward silence. Li knew that compared to Mingzhu, Rui, and Rui, he was indeed not a person with amazing aptitude. But he did not have to make this expression of a toad wanting to eat swan meat. Li was silent for a moment, then suddenly looked up at him and asked, Su and Senior Tian, what on earth is going on? Who wouldn't hurt each other? You stab me, I stab you back and forth, fair and just. Senior Tian was that old woman who was a grandmaster. This time it was Su's turn to be silent. He was silent for a moment and was about to speak when Li Yi reached out his hand and said, don't say it first. Let me guess. The story of the two of them was actually not difficult to guess. Based on old Su's obsession with martial arts, the words that the old woman shouted on the street, and his expression of love, hate, resentment, and joy when he looked at old Su, if he was so stupid that he couldn't even guess this story, how did he get Rui, Zumo, and Ruoqing? Why don't I tell you a story first? Li thought for a moment and said, once upon a time, there was a woman in Jianghu who vowed to become a grandmaster. When she carried a sword and rode a horse, she decided to march on the road of a grandmaster without stopping. Suddenly, a man appeared and hugged her tightly, telling her that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her, see all the romance in the world, and taste all the warmth and coldness of the human world. Old Su buried his head even deeper, letting Li Yi know that his train of thought was correct. The woman was very happy when she heard these words. She broke her sword and let go of the horse, wanting to spend the rest of her life with him, see all the romance in the world, and taste all the warmth and coldness of the human world. But when she looked back, he was gone. Li Yi looked at him and said, this is the story of a heartless man abandoning an infatuated woman. Are you that heartless man? I let her down. Elder Su sighed, then shook his head and said, but there's one thing you're wrong about. What is it? She is not a woman in Jianghu. When he said this, There was a rare, gentle smile on his face, and he murmured, "She is a young lady from a rich family. She doesn't know martial arts, but she is well-read, good at singing and dancing, and good at playing the zither. At that time, when I was practicing, she would always play the zither for me. Wait. Now is not the time to eat dog food." He couldn't help but interrupt him and asked, "You said she doesn't know martial arts?" If he wanted to refute him, there was no need to find such a flawed excuse. If a grandmaster didn't know martial arts, then what were they? Su shook his head and said, "At that time, she really didn't know martial arts. Logically speaking, when she was a teenager, she didn't learn martial arts. If she didn't know a cheating martial art like the turtle breathing skill, there was not much hope for her to become a grandmaster in this life. But that old woman should have been a grandmaster for a long time. In such a short period of time, she turned something rotten into something magical." Li felt that he might have found a shortcut to becoming a grandmaster. With a face full of expectation, he asked, "Then how did she become a grandmaster?" "Because she has a good aptitude." Su looked at him and said with a face full of disdain, "Her aptitude is far better than mine, thousands of times better than yours." He felt like he'd been hit by another arrow in his chest. The older the ginger, the wiser the fox. After going around in circles, he was still asking to be humiliated. However, when he looked up, he found that Su's face did not look proud at all. Instead, he looked a little pained. Li sighed and asked, "Do you regret it?" "I don't regret pursuing martial arts. I regret betraying her." Li thought for a moment and asked again, "If you regret it, why don't you go to her? Why did you leave the Wu Kingdom?" "Because she has a good aptitude." A few black lines appeared on Li Yi's forehead. It was enough to hurt his heart once or twice. Was there an end to it? Su looked ahead and said, "Back then, I made a bet with someone. Whoever became a grandmaster first would be the winner. For the sake of my reputation, I left her and cultivated in seclusion." Li Yi still didn't understand and asked, "What does this have to do with you leaving the Wu Kingdom and not going to her?" "As I said, she has a good aptitude." Looking ahead, Su looked a little frustrated and said, "After I left, she began to practice martial arts. Before I broke through to the grandmaster level, she had already broken through." Li Yi was stunned, and then his expression became strange. This might be the saddest story he had heard this year. Su continued, "After she became a grandmaster, she began to hunt me all over the Wu Kingdom. I had no choice but to leave the Wu Kingdom. Later, I didn't dare to go back to the Wu Kingdom, even after I became a grandmaster. Before I became a grandmaster, I was no match for her. After I became a grandmaster, I was still no match for her. All these years, I've been desperately practicing martial arts and improving myself, just so that one day I could come back above board, but I didn't know that after she broke through, she couldn't let go of the knot in her heart. Over the past decades, her martial arts didn't improve, but regressed." He was right. Su was indeed a man with a story. The story was full of twists and turns, with many twists and turns. It was unexpected, but reasonable, and it could be called the first tragic drama of the year. Thinking of the most important thing in this story, he looked at him and asked, "What about the person who made a bet with you that year? Has he become a grandmaster?" Su looked to the other side, where the white-haired old man was talking to Yang Liuking. Looking at his white hair, Li Yi then thought of the old man's desperate practice in the past few years. It was not difficult to imagine how much he had suffered in the past decades. Then he thought of the old woman who was still in a coma. "What a sin," he sighed, patted Su on the shoulder, pointed to the white-haired old man, and said, "If I were you, I would drag him out and bury him alive." Chapter 1100. Because of a bet, a pair of lovers had been separated, and the two had spent decades in entanglement and pain. Lovers had become enemies. Such people would go to hell if they died. Li couldn't care less about Su's affairs. He still owed a lot of romantic debts, so he was not interested in or qualified to care about other people's affairs. He sighed, stood up, and was ready to go to Rui to see what was going on. Rui couldn't overcome that hurdle. He finally had the hope to catch up with her. Now, Even Sue said that although she couldn't beat a guru couldn't do anything to her. His dream of becoming the master was ruthlessly shattered again. Wait a minute, Sue suddenly said. Anything else? Lee looked at him and thought to himself that this guy was really an unromantic guy. His old lover was hurt so badly, but he didn't stay by her side. Instead, he was here chatting with him. Even if he didn't know how to make a woman happy, he should have just asked. Did he have that mouth just to chew on a drumstick? Why didn't he know why he had been single all his life? He should have been more careful. Sue looked up at him and said, although you don't have a good aptitude for martial arts, you know how to make a woman happy. Teach me. He shook his head and said, you're wrong. I don't have a good aptitude for martial arts, and I don't know how to make a woman happy. You can ask the one who made the bet with you. Maybe he knows. If he knew, he wouldn't have lived alone for the rest of his life. Sue looked disdainful, then looked at Lee and said, I take back what I said just now. Although your aptitude is mediocre, with the help of magic skills, it's still possible for you to enter that realm in the future if you have the opportunity. Lee felt that his greatest weakness was that he was soft-hearted. Even though he had just been stabbed in the heart, he thought about how Elder Sue had helped them a lot over the past few years. Elder Sue had worked hard and was often abused by second-grade uncle, so he sat down. Considering your situation, I won't teach you the 36 stratagems of picking up girls. You can't be so boring. I'll teach you the 500 lines of love first. Remember it carefully. Sue is actually quite amazing. He didn't need to pick up girls, and the girls would come to him on their own. Their relationship was also vigorous and not conventional at all, being hunted by a grandmaster-level lover all over the world, hiding for decades. How could there be a second romantic love like this in this world? This kind of romance could only be compared to the first day he came here, when Rui snatched him up the mountain and gave him to Rui. After a while, Sue walked out from inside and said, that senior has woken up. Lee looked at Sue and gave him an encouraging look. Sue took a deep breath, stood up, and walked inside. Lee saw Rui and Ruaching walking over from his side. Rui looked at him and asked, how come I've never heard of hubby's 36 stratagems for picking up girls? I've never heard of 500 lines of love either. Where did hubby use those words of love? Lee was stunned on the spot. Rui looked at Ruaching and asked, have you heard of it? No. Ruaching shook her head with a smile. Rui looked at him and asked, did you say all those words of love to sisters Amo? Many people had died in Sangzhou. Zhu Amo felt that Li Mu was still young and not suitable to stay here, so she took her back to Rui City very early. Li couldn't explain himself for a while. In all honesty, he had always treated them with sincerity. He had never used these superficial things without any sincerity. Ahem, what are you talking about? How can I favor one and discriminate against the other? There's no such thing. Li coughed lightly and said, let's go watch the fun and bring me a handful of melon seeds. Sue had been insensitive for decades and had only learned a little theory. It was difficult to apply it to practice. Lee was really worried that he would mess things up. That senior was already seriously injured. If he was a little more agitated, the consequences would be unimaginable. He sat on a stone chair on the other side of the yard. From here, he could see into the room. He ate melon seeds while paying close attention to the situation in the room. In the room, the old woman was lying on the bed with a pale face. Sue walked over, put a quilt behind her, and helped her sit up. Then he sat by the bed. The two of them didn't look at each other and were silent. The frequency at which Lee ate melon seeds slowed down. After waiting for a while, he saw Sue take out something from his sleeve and say, do you want some candy? Although they were far away, Lee still saw it clearly. It was a piece of white rabbit creamy candy. White rabbit creamy candy. He had just said that women like surprises and romance. From time to time, he would give them some small things. They didn't need to be expensive to please them. How did he interpret small things as white rabbit creamy candy? Lee felt that he should give up. In fact, he and Yang Liuking's imperial granduncle seemed more compatible. However, what happened next was completely out of his expectations. Sue handed the white rabbit creamy candy to her and asked, do you want some candy? The old woman on the bed nodded and said yes. So Sue peeled off the wrapper and put the milk candy into her mouth. He asked, "Is it sweet?" The old woman nodded again. "Sweet. Sweet, it was really sweet." The melon seeds in Li Yi's mouth tasted like dog food. He vaguely understood one thing. Whatever methods of picking up girls, whatever theories, they were all fake. As long as the girl's heart was filled with you, there was no need for any other tricks. Even if you gave her a piece of white rabbit creamy candy, it would still be a trick. He suddenly remembered a sentence. That day, he accidentally saw a book called Mandarin Duck Handkerchief in Mississippi Lou's room. There was a sentence written in it. He forgot the original words, but the general meaning was that if a man really liked a woman, he would love everything about her, even if it was something bad in the eyes of others. On the other hand, when a woman liked a man, it was the same. In this very feudal era, the author of the book was really a god to be able to write such a thought-provoking philosophy. In the room, the old woman looked at Sue and asked, "Don't you have anything to say to me?" "Yes." Sue thought for a moment, looked into her eyes, sighed, and said, "There was once a sincere love in front of me, but I didn't cherish it. When I lost it, it was too late to regret it. If God could give me a chance to start over." "Bah!" He spat the melon seed skin on the ground. He couldn't listen anymore and turned to leave. Before leaving, he looked back and saw the old woman sitting there in a daze. Her face was touched, and tears flickered in her eyes. When Li walked past Yang Liuqing and the old man was talking to her. "This time, you were able to conquer these provinces in the northwest. It is indeed beyond my expectations." The old man sighed and said, "This old man only hates that I didn't kill that beast with my palm. My young royal family wouldn't have withered to this extent." Yang Liuqing lowered her head and didn't say anything. The old man suddenly looked at her and asked, "Everyone says that Fu was assassinated and died. Is this true or false?" Yang Liuqing looked at him. After a moment, she shook her head and said, "Yang Fu is still alive." "That's great." The old man, called Yang Wanli, stood up and said, "I heard that you have the weapons of the Jing Kingdom's army. It is extremely easy to break through the walls and attack the city. Yang Ze has already betrayed the people. You gather the army and fight all the way from here to the imperial capital. This is not a fantasy. At that time, kill that traitor, restore order, and support Fu to the throne. Only then can the Wu Kingdom have a way out." He stopped in his tracks and glanced over. Su walked out of the room with a face full of joy. Seeing Li Yi's expression, he asked, "What's wrong?" Li Yi looked at him and said, "About what I just said to Elder Su. You should reconsider it." Su was puzzled and asked, "Think about what?" Li Yi sighed and said, "Just bury him." Chapter 1101. This old man also did not expect that you would be able to obtain so many divine weapons from the Jin Kingdom. With the help of these things, as long as you have more than 100,000 soldiers, you will be invincible and invincible. No city will be able to stop you. And at most a year, you will be able to subdue all of the provinces and counties of the Wu Kingdom and bring your army to the imperial capital. The old man, called Yang Wanli, spoke in high spirits, as if he had already seen the scene he had described. He was completely unaware that the atmosphere had already quietly changed. Yang Liuqing lowered her head with a complicated expression. Li's gaze suddenly became emotionless. Su Tian looked at him and slightly shook his head. Yang Liuqing raised her head to look at Li Yi. Her lips moved. Although she did not speak, Li Yi understood her expression and did not say anything for the time being. Soon after, she turned her head to look at the white-haired old man and said seriously, "Imperial uncle, I want to be the emperor. With the red barbarian cannon, the imperial guards of the imperial capital will not be a match for you." As Yang Wanli's spittle flew, he suddenly stopped. After a moment of shock, he looked at her and asked, "What did you just say?" Yang Liuqing met his gaze, her expression still extremely serious. She said word by word, "I said, I want to be the emperor myself." Yang Wanli frowned and said in a deep voice, "Do you know what you were saying?" Yang Liuqing nodded and said, "I know. I said, after we fight our way to the imperial capital, I want to be the emperor myself." She repeated these words 3 times. Each time her expression became more and more serious, but each time her tone became more and more indifferent. It was as if she was saying something insignificant. She was not discussing it, but announcing it. A bunch of nonsense, a bunch of nonsense. The white-haired old man looked at her. Before he could reprimand her, Sue patted his shoulder and said, "Come with me." The white-haired old man glanced at Yang Liuqing and followed Sue to the other side. Sue stopped and turned his head to look at him. He said, "You better give up on your previous thoughts." Yang Wanli frowned. "Sue, what do you mean by this? I've seen Yang Fu." Sue shook his head and said, "That child is already useless. Rather than letting him become the emperor, it would be better to let the Wu kingdom continue to be in chaos." Yang Wanli glared at him and said, "Speak clearly." Sue looked at him and asked, "Do you know why your niece could conquer the entire northwest of the Wu kingdom in such a short time? Because they have the Jing kingdom's Tian Fa and the Red Barbarian cannon. Do you know where these things came from?" Yang Wanli was stunned, then shook his head. "That's Jiang of Silla from the Jing kingdom. He gave me these things." Sue pointed at Li Yi and continued, "You may not know who Jiang of Silla is, but it doesn't matter. All you need to know is why he helped your granddaughter. Why? His disciple sprained his ankle." Sue looked at him and said, "Because of that idiot grandson of yours. You may not believe it, but because of this simple reason, the world he obtained by killing his brother and father was gone with a bang." After listening to the story, Yang Wanli was stunned. When he came back to his senses, he looked at Sue and asked, "Do you think I'm muddle-headed?" Sue didn't answer. He looked at him and said for the last time, "The world of the Yang clan can fall into anyone's hands, but it can't fall into the hands of that idiot grandson of yours, and it can't fall into the hands of Yang Fu. Do you understand?" Yang Wanli looked at him for a long time and said in a deep voice, "What if I object? I will first cripple your martial arts." Sue looked at him and said, "Don't look at me like that. You're no match for me right now. You can't even beat the second young mistress. Even if you're not injured, I can still cripple your martial arts." Yang Wanli didn't doubt his strength. Although he was injured, his eyesight and perception were still there. He didn't want to admit it, but he had to admit that the current Sue was very strange, and he couldn't see through him. On the path to becoming a grandmaster, he had at least taken a big step ahead of them. Yang Wanli looked at him calmly. "We've been friends for decades, and you want to cripple my martial arts?" Sue shook his head and said, "I'm just advising you. Other than your granddaughter giving up on this herself, no one could stop her. You can't, I can't, and your grandson can't either. I won't do anything to you, but someone will. You can't even beat the second young mistress. What else can you do? Your man is here. Go and ask him yourself." Seeing Prime Minister Wang walk in, Sue looked at him and said to him, "I'll give you one last piece of advice. Don't mess with Jiang of Silla. After all, you can't even beat the second young mistress." He turned around and left. After taking 2 steps, he turned back and looked at Prime Minister Wang, saying, "Wait a minute." He walked back and kicked Yang Wanli's butt, sending the latter flying. "This kick is for the palm you just hit her with." His figure flashed, and he chased after him. Another voice came from outside the door. "This kick is for making her chase you for 2 months. This kick is for losing a bet with me. This kick is for my own will." Seeing Sue walk in, Li asked, "Is it done?" Sue nodded and said, "Don't worry. He's not a stubborn person. Otherwise, he would be the martial emperor now. I'm not asking him." Li shook his head. Did it make any difference whether the old man did it or not? He couldn't even beat Rui. If he didn't listen to him, he could just drag him out and bury him. He looked at Sue and said, "I'm talking about the one in the room." Old Sue blushed, which was rare. This was the first time that Li Yi had seen admiration on his face. Sue nodded and said, "You taught me a good way." Li Yi shook his head. It wasn't that he taught him a good way. It was that the old woman's feelings for him hadn't diminished after decades. Instead, they had become more and more mellow. He didn't believe that he could give a white rabbit creamy candy to a random girl on the street and hold her hand and say sweet words to her. It would be strange if the old hooligan didn't arrest him to take him to the officials. "Uncle." Yang Liuqing walked to his side and said in a low voice, You are the future empress. You have to show the aura that you used to talk to your uncle just now. He looked at her and said, "Stick out your chest and raise your head." Bai Su was standing next to Yang Liuqing, shoulder to shoulder. She didn't notice it before, but when she raised her head and raised her chest, the contrast between the two was a little obvious. Bai Su was very sensitive to certain things. She immediately noticed the difference between the two. She glared at Li Yi fiercely and turned away. Li Yi just wanted to cultivate Yang Liuqing's confidence. This time, he really didn't do it on purpose. But then again, Mississippi Lu's apprentice really didn't embarrass her. He didn't want to say that. What he wanted to say was that the current Yang Liuqing had already made him very satisfied. The words she said in front of old man Yang just now were neither servile nor overbearing. She was unquestionable. She already had a little bit of what an empress should have. On one side, Yang Liuqing raised her chest and raised her head. On the other side, Prime Minister Wang was scolded by old man Yang. "What kind of prime minister are you? You actually didn't tell me such a big thing. The former emperor handed King Jing to you. How did you teach him? How did you teach him to be like this? How did you face the former emperor?" After scolding Prime Minister Wang, Yang Wanli finally vented his anger. He strode over, looked at Li Yi and said, "Jiang of Silla, come in with me." "Don't worry." Li Yi faced Yang Liuqing's worried eyes and followed Yang Wanli into a room. "Yang Fu can't be the emperor." Without waiting for him to speak, Li Yi went straight to the point. "I'm the one who gave them their weapons. I'm the one who gave them Sky's punishment. I'm also the one who gave them the Red Barbarian Cannon. I'm also the one who came up with their revolutionary plans. Do you think that I did all of this because I have too much money to burn?" Yang Wanli looked at him and said aggressively, "You gave her weapons, Tianfa, and the Red Barbarian Cannon. You helped her make a plan to make her the next emperor of the Wu Kingdom. You must have a motive for everything you do. If you didn't do all of this because you have too much money to burn, then tell me, were you after?" Li Yi really wanted to tell him that he actually did all of this because he had too much money to burn. Yang Liuqing was Rui's disciple and his martial nephew. Even if he wanted to burn money, burning it on her was obviously better than burning it on someone else. Moreover, this money was just an investment. There would be generous returns in the future. Most importantly, this money also carried a great dream of his. Of course, none of this had anything to do with this old man. He didn't need to explain it to him. Li looked at him and said calmly, "She is my martial nephew. I am willing to help her. You don't have to worry about me. You must have a motive for giving." Yang Wanli looked at him, and a thoughtful expression appeared on his face. After a moment, he seemed to realize something. He suddenly slammed the table and said angrily, "You beast! She is your martial nephew." Chapter 1102. Although Li wasn't familiar with this old man called Yang Wanli, and it was their first time meeting, he could almost conclude that he was a very selfish person. What you give, you must want. How selfish must a person be to say something so selfish? His mother had raised him up and sacrificed so much. What was he after? Prime Minister Wang was already so old, yet he gave up the luxurious life in the imperial capital and the high position of prime minister, who was below only one person but above tens of thousands of people, and risked his life to follow Yang Liuqing around, wholeheartedly assisting her. What was he after? Mississippi Lu, because of the master-disciple relationship, gathered the masters of the Lu Alliance to help her take down 5 cities. What was she after? This old man wasn't only selfish, but also arrogant. He liked to impose his thoughts on others. Yang Liuqing was his martial nephew. He helped his martial nephew take revenge, help his martial nephew fulfill his wish, help his martial nephew plan his life. What was going on? What was going on? Yang Wanli looked at him and said in a low voice, "Since ancient times, there has never been a female emperor." "Forget it," Li interrupted him with a wave of his hand. "Don't think that you can speak irresponsibly just because you're old. Who says that no woman has ever been an emperor since ancient times? Do you not pay any attention to current affairs other than cultivating? Also, even if there isn't a female emperor, Why can't she be the first? You. Yang Wanli was speechless at Li Yi's question. He took a deep breath and said, "What if this old man firmly opposes? Then drag him out and bury him." "You won't do that." "I really won't." Li Yi nodded. No matter what, this old man was one of the few relatives of Yang Liuqing. He couldn't really drag him out and bury him. However, he was quite popular in the Wu Kingdom. If he was determined to go against them, there would be some unnecessary trouble. "I can cripple your martial arts, find a courtyard, and let you live out the rest of your life in peace. What do you think of this suggestion?" Li looked at him and asked, "Can you beat our second miss? What about after she becomes the emperor?" Yang Wanli took a deep breath and thought. He looked at him and asked, "Who will she pass the empire to?" "That's her business. Didn't Prime Minister Wang tell you just now?" He shook his head and said, "Whether it's passed to her son or daughter, that's your Yang family's business. You can pass it to whoever you want, but it won't be passed to my son. It has nothing to do with me." Li knew what old Yang was worried about. He wasn't worried that Yang Liuqing would become the first emperor in the Wu Kingdom or even the world. He was worried that Yang Liuqing would interfere with the Wu Kingdom's imperial power. He had experienced this kind of thing once in the Jing Kingdom. If it weren't for the fact that his family had no interest in being the emperor of the Wu Kingdom would have been his child instead of Yang Liuqing's. Old Yang would have been planted in the ground instead of standing here and talking to him. He had explained everything clearly. He glanced at Yang Wanli, turned around, and walked out of the room. Compared with wasting time here, he wanted to see what was going on with Rui. He was a little confused. He hoped that Rui could make a breakthrough, but he didn't want Rui to make a breakthrough. He hoped that she could realize her wish, but he didn't want to live under her shadow for the rest of his life. If she didn't make a breakthrough, he would have a chance to turn things around. If she made a breakthrough, he could only be suppressed by her for the rest of his life. After a while, Rui had already walked out of the room. Li walked over and asked nervously, "How was it? Did you make a breakthrough?" Mississippi Lu glanced at him and said, "I just had some enlightenment. It's not so easy to break through to the supreme power realm." Li let out a long sigh of relief. Mississippi Lu looked at him and asked, "You seem to be very happy." Li was startled and said, "I'm happy for you that you have a new understanding, but it's fine if you didn't break through. Elder Su said that you broke through by chance. After a while, let's go out and enjoy the scenery. Maybe when the chance comes, you'll naturally break through." Li patted her on the shoulder and said, "Student Rui, keep working hard. I believe that day will come." The appearance of Yang Wanli and Senior Tian was an accident. Under the influence of Su's sloppy charm, the matter was finally settled. Senior Tian leaned against the bed, took Yang Liuqing's hand, and said apologetically, "Miss, I'm sorry." Yang Liuqing smiled, indicating that she did not care. Old Yang changed his clothes. He was not liked by the other two Supreme Power Realm Masters and was discussing something with Prime Minister Wang, Wei Liang, and the others. When he saw Li walk into the room, he hurried over and called Yang Liuqing over, as if he was guarding against a thief. In fact, 3 Supreme Power Realm Masters were enough to sneak into the Imperial Palace of the Wu Kingdom and use violent means to force the current Emperor Wu to abdicate. However, Senior Tian was seriously injured and her foundation was damaged. She needed a long time to recuperate. Old Su would definitely be by her side, so this plan could not be carried out for the time being. Secondly, Li did not want to do this. Although forcing the Emperor Wu to abdicate could directly achieve their ultimate goal, it would only be a superstructure, and the foundation would not be stable. The Wu Kingdom would still be a chaotic Wu Kingdom, which was not in line with their original intention. The strategy they adopted was to fight and govern, establish a foothold in the northwest, and expand one state and one city after another. Although this would take some time, after she ascended the throne, the internal strife of the Wu Kingdom would also end. With a wave of her hand, it would be a new era of the Empress. She was injured and needs to recuperate. "This time, I won't go back with you." Su looked at Senior Tian on the bed, then turned to look at him and said. Li nodded. The Wu Kingdom was basically settled. Shuzhou and Rui City had been stable. Su would stay here to take care of Senior Tian and protect Yang Liuqing at the same time, in case old Yang regretted it. Since he had taken the initiative to suggest it, there was no need for him to say it himself. In fact, they did not have anything important to do next. They would probably go sightseeing, travel around various countries, fulfill Rui's Jianghu dream, and accompany Rui and the others. Of course, in the process, whether it was the Qi Kingdom or the Jing Kingdom, there were still some things that needed to be settled. Of course, these were all things that needed to be planned after they returned to Rui City. Su thought for a while, then looked at him and asked, "You're going to the Qi Kingdom, right?" Li nodded slightly. It was a must to go to the Qi Kingdom. The business in the Qi Kingdom had been handed over to Miss Lin. Even he himself did not expect that he would be a hands-off boss for 4 years. Every year, the silver shipped from the Qi Kingdom accounted for more than 10% of the total income of the mansion. It seemed to be only 10%, but it was already a very terrifying number. In these 4 years, apart from a regular letter, he had no other contact with Miss Lin. In addition, it was time to settle the grudges with the Taoist nun and the holy religion. Su looked at him and said, "If there is any news about the Taoist nun, let me know immediately." Su was a very strange person. He had suffered so much in the past, and the main culprit was obviously second great uncle, but he could not forget the Taoist nun, thinking day and night of teaching her how to be a good person. This was a typical case of bullying the weak and fearing the strong. What Taoist nun? The old woman leaning against the headboard suddenly asked. "A female grandmaster." Li thought for a while, then said, "She is old friends with Su." "A female grandmaster?" Elder Tian's eyes moved. He looked at Su and asked, "If there is any news, I will let you know immediately. Do you really want to see her?" "Yes." Su nodded, then gritted his teeth and said, "Even in my dreams." Li sighed, then turned and walked out of the room. As a single dog who had been single all his life, there were some things that he could not teach him if he did not experience them himself. Today's lesson should be able to let him understand a little. When faced with extreme situations, he should erupt with a strong desire to survive and not a strong desire to die. Chapter 11:03. Su seemed to have understood something. When he walked out of the room, his expression was one of astonishment and contemplation. He looked at Li, who was standing in the courtyard, and asked, "Why is she angry?" Su's question was very good. Why is she angry? Why is she still angry? Why is she angry again? These were 3 world-class philosophical questions, each more difficult than the last. Countless scholars, ancient and modern, Chinese and foreign, had studied these questions, but none of them had come to a conclusion. This was an unsolvable problem. When she was angry, the only way to survive was through a strong desire to live. Li thought for a moment and said, "Never tell a woman that you miss another woman in front of her, even if you don't treat her as a woman, or even as a person." Su was confused. "But that damn Taoist nun is my enemy." "First of all, she is a woman that you dream of." Li looked at him and said, "Other than Elder Tian, the only woman you dream of is your mother. But my mother passed away decades ago, so there are no exceptions." Li felt that he had made it clear enough. If Elder Su still did not understand the deeper meaning behind his words, then he was not prepared to teach him anymore. It would be more dignified to talk about a smart, naive, and adorable student like Shoning. If he were to talk about a student with such poor comprehension skills, he, the great King Jing, would not be able to bear the embarrassment. Su nodded as if he understood. He asked, "Then why didn't you stop me just now? If I had stopped you, you would never have realized this problem." This actually involved a higher level of knowledge that he did not understand at the moment. In the past few years, Li had used his own experience to explain that the desire to live was not innate. It was a precious experience that he had learned through constant courting death and experiencing many successes and failures. If he was already a king in this aspect, then Elder Su was just an LVL 1 rookie. He still had a long way to go in terms of leveling up, and it was bound to be interspersed with countless blood and tears. Sue thought for a moment and nodded. He said seriously, "Teach me a little more." In fact, there was no shortcut to this path. He really didn't know where to start when he asked so bluntly. He thought for a moment and said, "I recommend you a book. You should read it when you have time." The book is called Mandarin Duck Handkerchief. It depicts the psychology of women very deeply and vividly. If you want to conquer women, you must first understand women. He had been a complete stranger to love in the beginning, but in the past few years, he had realized some things through his own experience. The longer time passed, the more he admired the great goddess who wrote the Mandarin Duck Handkerchief. Her knowledge and understanding of the relationship between men and women were so deep that he was convinced. He almost prostrated himself before her. Mandarin Duck Handkerchief. Sue nodded and asked, "Where can I buy it?" This was the key question. Mandarin Duck Handkerchief could only be found in the Jing Kingdom, and it was also copied among women. It was forbidden to be sold on the market. She only knew Mississippi Lou had it. She would ask for him later. "I'll ask for you later." Lee thought of something and asked, "You said that Rui needs a chance to break through to the supreme power realm. What is a chance?" He still hoped that Rui could achieve her wish. Even if he would be under her for the rest of his life, he did not care. It did not matter to him whether he was on top or below, as long as she liked it. Sue looked out of the courtyard wall and said, "Between life and death, love and hatred." Lee looked at him and asked, "Which one do you belong to?" Back then, I was high-spirited and vigorous. I roamed the Jianghu and helped the weak. I made many enemies. One time, I was chased by my enemies and my life was hanging by a thread. Only then did I comprehend the great path of a grandmaster. One aperture after another, I turned defeat into victory and killed all my enemies with my sword. Sue said it casually, but Li Yi heard the thrill in it. People's potential was forced out. Between life and death, one could realize the slim chance of survival and break through the shackles of martial arts. It sounded like it. But how many people in the Wu Kingdom and how many Supreme Power Realm Masters were there? The old lady lying on the bed must belong to the second kind. Yang Wanli did not know, but he was the first kind. There were so many people who practiced martial arts in the Wu Kingdom, but there were only 2 people who broke through to the Supreme Power Realm between life and death. What about the others? Those who did not break through were all dead. Li did not want Rui to choose the first way. If something happened to her, who could he find a sister-in-law who could cook so well? He looked at Sue and asked, "What does love and hatred mean?" Separation in life and death, great joy and great sorrow, and great ups and downs. Great joy and sorrow, and great ups and downs belong to emotions. It was not difficult to understand. It was similar to turning sorrow and anger into strength, or suddenly exploding in a small universe. Taoist, none belonged to this kind. Her whole family was slaughtered, so she became a young supreme power, but there was also a risk. If after great joy and sorrow, she did not break through to the supreme power realm, but had a cerebral hemorrhage and epilepsy, it would not be worth it. He frowned slightly and asked, "Is there no other gentler way?" "That depends on your luck." Sue shook his head and said, "Yang Wanli became a supreme power after a night's sleep." As far as I know, your wife did not spend much effort to become a supreme power. Chanda was born with a disability, so he is different from normal people like us. We can't compare him. That ox nose in your Jing Kingdom is famous all the time, but he is only a supreme power. Li looked at him and asked, after saying so much, "If you want to become a supreme power," Sue nodded and said, "It still depends on your luck." After saying so much, they went back to the topic of luck. Li planned to borrow books from Mississippi Lou first. When it came to martial arts, it was better to let nature take its course. Life and death, and great ups and downs, it was better for her to treat him better. She would rub his shoulders and cook his noodles. Maybe she could share some of his transmigrata halo with her, and he would become a supreme power after a night's sleep. Rui never hid her knowledge in martial arts. When Li walked into her room, she was teaching by Sue in Yangliuking. No wonder their martial arts improved so quickly. Rui always gave them special lessons, helping them step by step and teaching them personally. It would be strange if he could leave them behind. He walked to the bedside and said, "Rui, lend me the book under your pillow." Mississippi Lou was busy. She looked up and asked casually, "What book?" "The Mandarin Duck Handkerchief." Lee lifted her pillow and said, "The one you made notes on, the one you wrote a lot of thoughts in." "Yeah. Where did it go?" Mississippi Lou stood up abruptly and looked at him with a face full of shame and anger. "You went through my stuff? I accidentally saw it once. What are you so nervous about?" Lee glanced at her and said, "It's not me who wants it. It's Sue who wants to read it. You can lend it to him. When Elder Tion recovers, he can provide you with another Grandmaster to practice with." I threw it away. Mississippi Lou glared at him, the anger in her eyes still lingering. "Threw it away?" He shook his head. "It would be a waste to throw it away." She looked at Yang Liuqing and asked, "Do you have this book?" Yang Liuqing's face turned red. She would not lie. It seemed that she did have it. Li was about to ask again, but she lowered her head and said softly, "I left it in Rui City. I didn't bring it." Li looked at Bai Su. Bai Su took out a thin book from her sleeve and threw it to him. She said lightly, "Remember to return it to me after reading it." The white heroine was indeed forthright. Li handed the book to Elder Su and told him to keep it safe. After he finished reading it, he realized a problem. The Mandarin Duck Handkerchief was the ancient version of the 36 stratagems for catching a man. It taught women how to pick up men. Why did Bai Su read this kind of book? Did she also want to understand women's minds? It was unnecessary. If she had the time, she might as well learn how to pick up girls from him. However, the Mandarin Duck Handkerchief could be called the emotional textbook for women in the Jing Kingdom. It was too widely spread. In the past, he only knew that Xiao Huan and Xiao Chui had it. He did not expect that even Rui and Yang Liuqing could not avoid it. Even Bai Su carried one with her. He wondered if Mingzi had it. The strange thing was that Rui, Ruoqing, and Zue Mo had been with him day and night, but he had never seen them read it. During the meal, Li finally asked this question. Rui looked at him, shook her head, and said, "I've heard of the Mandarin Duck Handkerchief, but I've never seen it." Ruoqing also shook her head slightly and said, "I've seen it with a sister before. I flipped through a few pages, but then I was delayed by something, so I didn't read it again." "Why do you ask this?" "Nothing. I'm just asking." Li put their favorite dishes in their bowls. Looking at Mississippi Lou and Yang Liuqing opposite him, he thought that nothing could be biased. After all, Rui and Ruoqing were different from single dogs who had no partners. Chapter 1104. After careful calculation, Li and Rui had been in Sangzhou for a long time. They came here 2 months before the Spring Festival and went back to Rui City for the New Year. Just after the Lantern Festival, they came to Sangzhou again. Previously, he was worried that Yang Liuqing and the others would not be able to carry out all aspects of work smoothly after they took over Sangzhou. After such a long time of learning, she had a clear understanding of the revolutionary routine. Since she could be a good leader, Li had nothing to worry about. With old Yang and Su watching over her, Li no longer had any concerns about her safety. After staying in Sangzhou for a few more days, it was the day of departure that Li and Rui had discussed. Zue Mo and Li Mu were still waiting for them in Rui City, so it was not good for them to stay in Sangzhou for a long time. Moreover, the Wu Kingdom's worries were gone, and there would not be any problems in the following development. Li had no reason to stay here. "Senior sister, goodbye." Li Duan sat in the carriage, lifted the curtain, and waved at Yang Liuqing vigorously. Yang Liuqing was his senior sister in name, but in fact, she was half his master. Rui only spanked him when he was disobedient, and the usual teaching was done by Yang Liuqing. Rui and Ruoqing got on the carriage, and Mississippi Lou, Bai Su, and Yang Liuqing talked. Bai Su was not the #1 master under Mississippi Lou, but she did grow the fastest. Whether it was martial arts or broad-mindedness, she was deeply trusted by Mississippi Lou. It was not too much to call by Sue her right-hand man. Senior Tion still needed a long time to recuperate, but small-scale activities were not a problem. She stood with Sue and saw them off. "I'll look for you after she recovers." Sue took a few steps forward and said. Then he lowered his voice so that only he and Li Yi could hear and whispered, "If there's any news about Taoist Nun, send me a letter immediately." Actually, he did not have to speak so softly. Senior Tion's body had not yet recovered, so he could not hear what he said. Li Yi looked at him and said, "Before I leave, I want to teach you one last principle." Sue nodded and pretended to listen attentively. Whatever Li Yi taught him, he followed it as a philosophy of life. Never trust others unconditionally. A smile appeared on Li Yi's face as he said, "Except for yourself." A puzzled look appeared on Sue's face. "What do you mean?" Li Yi patted him on the shoulder and said with a smile, "Don't worry. If there's any news about Taoist Nun, I'll send you a letter immediately." Li Yi did not deliberately lower his voice, so it was clear. When he felt a sharp gaze behind him, which made his back feel a little cold, Sue finally understood what Li Yi wanted to teach him. He narrowed his eyes and gritted his teeth. "I'll remember it." When Li Yi turned around and was about to leave, he clearly saw that the old man named Yang Wanli let out a sigh of relief. He wanted to tell him that he was thinking too much and that he had no interest in the Yang family's Wu Kingdom at all. But after thinking about it, he gave up. He liked to guess, so let him keep guessing. He waved to the crowd, and when he turned around again, a voice came from behind him. "Uncle." He turned around and saw Yang Liuqing coming over. Yang Liuqing walked to Li Yi's side, looked at him, and asked, "Uncle, I don't know when we can meet again after this farewell. Can I hug you?" Not far behind her, Yang Wanli's body stiffened and his face changed greatly. Li was also taken aback. Then he smiled and opened his arms. Yang Liuqing paused for a moment, then took a step forward and gave him a light hug. They separated as soon as they touched. A smile bloomed on her face as she waved her hand. "Martial aunt, goodbye, goodbye." Li Yi waved and got on the carriage. Bai Su walked out from behind Yang Liuqing and looked at her with a hint of teasing on her face. She said, "Our otherworldly empress, which man do you want to deal with that Mandarin duck handkerchief?" She whispered in her ear and walked to the carriage with her hands behind her back. Then she turned around and waved. "Let's go." The group of carriages moved further and further away. Yang Wanli's face was as black as charcoal. "Su Tion, come in with me." Senior Tion looked at Su Tion, then turned around and walked back to his room. "Little brat." Su sighed softly and followed in with his head lowered. Yang Liuqing watched the carriages go away. After a long time, she let out a sigh of relief. When she turned around, her aura was completely different. She looked at Wei Liang and Chun Qing standing behind her and said, "Send a letter to the provincial governors of Su Prefecture and Qin Prefecture. I will only give them 3 days to consider. If they don't surrender in 3 days, they won't have the chance to surrender anymore." Wei Liang knelt on one knee and cupped his fists. "Understood." It had been a few days since Li Yi returned to Rui City. Rui, Zui, and Mo, and even his godmother felt that Sangzhou was a place of slaughter. Countless souls had died on the battlefield, so they didn't want Li Mu and Yongning to stay there for long. After not seeing him for a few months, little Li Mu really missed him. She even wanted to sleep with him. It was said that daughters and fathers were close, and this was true. This matter made Zui and Mo very jealous. After all, she was the one who gave birth to Li Mu and had always been by her side. Seeing how close she was to Li Yi, she could only call her little heartless. Li Mu, who was about to be 1 year old, could already say words like father and mother. Under Zui and Mo's guidance, she could also say some other words. The rest of the credit belonged to Yongning, who watched her and talked to her all day. At 11 years old, Yongning no longer looked like the little girl with dementia 5 or 6 years ago. When Li Yi first saw Shanning, she was probably her age. She was his aunt and also the king of the children in the family. The person Li Duan admired the most was her, because her martial arts were better than Li Duan's, and she would play with him. There were no peers around him, and the one who was the youngest than him was his aunt. Li Duan was talking to Li Mu at the side. Xiao Mu, when you're a little older, brother can play with you. You have to grow up quickly. When you grow up, Xiao Nyang will come to see you, Li Mu giggled. Xiao Nyang. Li Yi sat in the yard drinking the grape wine that Xiao Zhu had made for a long time. Unfortunately, there was no one to drink with him. Fong could barely be considered half a companion, but he was busy with other things these days. He was about to go on a long journey, and he didn't know how long he would be gone this time. Naturally, there were a lot of things to prepare. Rui was also very busy recently. Before she left, she needed to pick some people to go with her, and the matters in the league had to be arranged properly. Bai Su also liked to drink, and as her chest became more and more erect, her attitude towards him became better and better. Unfortunately, she followed behind Mississippi Liu all day long, and Li Yi really couldn't find anyone for a while. He sighed and raised the wine cup. Halfway through, he suddenly put it down and lightly slapped his palm behind him. The two palms collided, and Li Yi felt as if his palm had fallen into a ball of cotton, unable to advance or retreat. In just an instant, he understood two things. First, the other party had no ill intentions. Second, the other party's strength was far superior to his, and it could even be said to be heaven and earth apart. A sinister voice came from behind him. Not bad. I haven't seen you for a few years, and you haven't slacked off in martial arts. The voice was very familiar, but he hadn't heard it for a few years. Li Yi was stunned for a moment, and the next moment, a smile appeared on his face. He looked at Fong, who had just walked into the yard, and laughed loudly. Bring the wine, the strongest kind. Chapter 1105. Chong was a man who always spoke in a gloomy way and had a deadpan face, which made him very unpopular. His name was enough to make countless officials and nobles in the capital tremble with fear. Ordinary people might not have heard of Manager Chong, but in the rich and powerful families, his name could stop children from crying at night. Li had never felt so close to this deadpan face as he did now. Fong brought the strongest wine in the mansion. It was not the kind of wine that was distilled by industrial distillation. It was the first batch of wine officially brewed after the improvement of the process. I've been to a lot of places and drunk a lot of wine in the past few years. Your wine is the best to my taste. No wonder His Majesty couldn't forget it. Chong didn't drink like Fong and the others, who drank with their heads raised. After drinking, a small part of the wine was spilled on his neck and body. He drank cup by cup, and sometimes he savored it carefully. He didn't waste a drop. He had followed the former emperor for most of his life, so he always talked about him. After drinking a few cups, Li Yi slowed down and asked, "Where have you been these years?" Chong refilled his cup and said, "Everywhere, north and south of the Yangtze River, His Majesty had a wish when he was alive. He wanted to go to every state and every county in the Jing Kingdom. His Majesty is gone, so only I can fulfill his wish." The former emperor once said that he wanted to go to every state and every county in the Jing Kingdom. So Chang's footprints have been to every state and every county in the Jing Kingdom. With such a loyal servant, the former emperor's spirit in heaven should be very happy. Li took a sip of wine and asked, "What's your plan next?" "The world is so big, but this is the only place that is interesting. I plan to stay here and teach a few disciples. I'll enjoy a few years of peace and happiness." "What do you think, Your Highness King Jing?" What was there to think about? Li agreed with both hands and feet. Chong was a guru and one of the best among the gurus. He was as rare as the feathers of a phoenix or the horns of a qilin. Compared to a guru, the national first-class protected animals paled in comparison. Once old Tian recovered from his injuries, and with the addition of Su, Li Yi counted with his fingers, it would be incredible. If he could also capture old Taoist Yuan, their family would have the 5 unparalleled masters. This was not even considering second great-uncle or Rui, who was half a step in a grandmaster. In the future, we can turn Rui City into a retirement home for the grandmasters. High benefits and pensions will provide a strong guarantee for these lonely old heroes in their later years. We welcome all the grandmasters to settle down here, Grandpa Chong. Yongning ran over from afar with a smile on her face. Her voice was crisp and filled with joy. Your Highness Yongning. Changde looked at her and revealed a rare smile. Your Highness has grown so tall in just a few years. Li Duan followed behind Yongning. He had seen Chang when he was young. However, he was too young at that time and probably did not have much of a memory of him now. He looked at him curiously. This is your duenna, isn't it? Changde grabbed his arm and squeezed it. He nodded and said, his foundation is not bad. He's a good seedling for martial arts. He extended his hand and searched Li Duan's body from head to toe. When his hand reached his crotch, Li Duan finally could not help but run away. He hid behind Yongning and looked at Changde with fear in his eyes. Not bad, not bad. Chang repeated the word not bad a few times. This was extremely rare. Dragons would give birth to dragons, and phoenixes would give birth to phoenixes. Rui had broken through to Grandmaster at a young age. Naturally, her son would not be bad either. Su had also said that his son's foundation was very good and much better than his father's. During this period, under the awe of Mississippi Liu, he had been exceptionally diligent in his cultivation. Rui and Su would often give him pointers. There was no shortage of grandmasters around him. His future achievements would not be too low. Chang looked at him and said, I have never accepted a disciple in my life. I don't want my martial arts to be lost. Your son has a good aptitude. It won't be a disgrace to my name if I accept him as my disciple. What do you think? It was naturally good to have a grandmaster as a disciple. However, Su had also expressed the intention to accept Li Duan as a disciple when he was a little older. Li Yi hesitated for a moment and asked, Master, I don't need to purify my body, right? Li Duan tugged at Yongning's sleeve curiously and asked, Little aunt, what is purifying my body? Yongning shook her head and said, I don't know either. Li Yi carried Li Duan over and whispered something in his ear. Li Duan's eyes widened. He jumped down from his legs and ran outside quickly. He was a man. Only those with a small penis were men. He did not want to cut it off. Even if this old man was very powerful, even if he was more powerful than his aunt, he would not cut it off. Li watched him run out and said, Su has the same idea. Let's wait for Li Duan to grow up a little. That Su guy? Chang frowned and said, That Su guy's martial arts are lousy. How can he be compared to me? Li knew about the grudge between Su and Chang. A few years ago, he had personally witnessed the battle that involved a man's pride. That battle ended in a draw. Since then, Su had been looking for trouble at second great uncle's place every day. He was no longer the Su Tian from 3 years ago. Chang had been touring the world these few years. He did not know if he had achieved a breakthrough. He did not have the heart to tell Chang that Su was different from him now. He was old and had a sunset glow. When Elder Tian recovered, the two grandmasters would join forces and teach him a lesson in a matter of minutes. If Old Yang's love-hate gay friend was added to the equation, Chang's chances of winning were close to zero. Changde looked at Yongning, who was chasing after Li Duan, and nodded. He said, You have taken good care of Her Highness Yongning these few years. You did not let His Majesty down. Li Yi cupped his hands. It's my duty, but what about Her Highness Imingzu and Shanning? Changde changed the topic. He furrowed his brows and asked, You left them in the capital for many years while you enjoyed yourself here. What did you promise His Majesty back then? Li Yi opened his mouth. This was a question that could not be answered in a few words. He paused, then said, That's why I said that Li Xian is really not a good person. The previous emperor passed the throne to him, but he left everything to Emingzu. Is there any emperor like this? You were the one who promised the previous emperor. Come, let's drink. Don't change the topic. Let's get drunk. It had been a long time since Li Yi had gotten drunk. Under Chang's questioning, he held the jar of wine and gulped down a few mouthfuls. He immediately became drunk. My head is so dizzy. He shook his head and stood up. He waved his hand toward the other side of the courtyard and said, Xiao Huan, help me to rest. The servant girl quickly ran over and put Li Yi's arm on her shoulder. She helped him walk into the room. Li was really drunk. He took off his shoes, laid on the bed with his clothes on, and quickly fell asleep. Xiao Huan fetched some hot water, wetted the cloth, and wrung it dry. She carefully wiped his face and palm. She had done this action countless times and could control her strength very well. Even in his sleep, a comfortable expression appeared on Li Yi's face. After she finished wiping Li Yi's face and palm, she put the cloth back into the basin, covered him with the blanket, and quietly left. When she reached the door, she turned her head back and looked at the figure lying on the bed. Her gaze was somewhat confused and dim after a long time. She turned and left, leaving behind only a faint sigh. Chapter 1106. The difference between a good wine and a bad wine was the taste and the headache after a hangover. The wine he drank with Chang yesterday was his treasure. He didn't even want to let Xiao Zhu experiment with it. When he woke up in the morning, he only had a slight headache. Xiao Huan wet the towel and walked over to help him wipe his face. Li Yi took the towel from her hand and said, "I'll do it myself." He wiped his face. Xiao Huan took the towel from his hand and put it back in the basin. She turned and walked out. When he put on his clothes and got out of bed, he felt that something was wrong. It wasn't the first time he had this feeling. Ever since he came back from Cangzhou, he felt that something was different. But when he thought about it carefully, he couldn't remember what it was. He sat at the table and frowned. This feeling made him very uncomfortable. He woke up late this morning. Rui and the others had already finished breakfast. Xiao Huan brought the heated food in, put it on the table, and walked out. Li picked up the chopsticks. Halfway through, his expression froze. He knew where the difference came from. Quiet, too quiet. In the past, when he woke up, Xiao Huan would stand by the bed and hand him a towel. When he wiped his face, she would tell him about the new things that happened between the maids and the Fu. When he ate, Xiao Huan would sit beside him or across from him. She would hold her chin with one hand or both hands and watch him eat in a daze. When he found out, she would smile foolishly and her eyes curved into crescent moons. When he was writing in the study, she stood by the side to grind the ink. After she was done, she walked behind him, put her hands behind her back, and tiptoed to see what he was writing, even though she didn't recognize many of the words, not anymore. She would still hand him a hot towel in the morning, but she wouldn't sit across from him when he ate. When he was in the study, she would grind the ink and leave by herself for fear of disturbing him. Several times, Li Yi saw her sitting alone in the courtyard in a daze. Xiao Huan used to be in a daze, but it was rare for her to be in a daze for several hours like recently. Li Yi felt a little guilty. Ever since he arrived in Shuzhou 3 years ago, he had been tossing and turning in the chaotic land and the Wu Kingdom. He rarely had any free time. She loved to listen to him tell stories. How long had it been since he last sat in the courtyard and let her massage his shoulders while he told her a story? It was so long ago that he could no longer remember it clearly. Xiao Huan's significance to him was irreplaceable. Xiao Chui could not. Xiao Zhu could not. Even Rui and Rui could not. When he first came to this world, when he was at his most hesitant and helpless, the one who was always by his side was actually not Rui, nor was it Rui. The Xiao Huan at that time was still a silly and adorable little maid, only knew how to circle around him, liked to listen to his stories, liked to eat the food he cooked. She was always chattering and seemed to have endless things to say. When did she become so reticent? Rui walked in from outside and sat beside him. She said softly, "Hubby." Li Yi raised his head. She looked over and asked, "Hubby, do you know what day it is tomorrow? March 21st. March 21st was not his and Rui's wedding anniversary, nor was it Rui's birthday, nor was it Rui's birthday. March 21st was Xiao Huan's birthday. Li Yi's face was full of regret. If it wasn't for Rui's reminder, he actually forgot about Xiao Huan's birthday. Rui saw the expression on his face and knew that he had remembered. She looked at him and said softly, "After this birthday, Xiao Huan will be 20 years old." Li Yi sighed softly. "Little maid has grown up. Xiao Huan is concubine's Tong Fong maid." Concubine knows hubby felt that Xiao Huan was too young, but after today, she will be 20 years old. If a Tong Fong maid is not a Tong Fong maid, she will be an ordinary maid. Others might not dare to say it openly, but what would they think of her? Rui looked at him, shook her head, and said, "These things Xiao Huan will not tell hubby. Hubby yourself will not think of it." Li Yi's eyes were slightly dazed. In his memory, the little maid was always that little maid with two buns, or a bun on her head, swaying around in front of him. He did not realize that Li Duan was already 4 years old. Yongning had already grown into a young lady. In a few more months, even if it was measured by the future generation standards, Shawnee would be considered an adult. Little maid actually was not a little maid for a long time. Xiao Chui had just coaxed Li Mu to sleep and walked back to the courtyard that belonged to her, Xiao Zhu and Xiao Huan. Xiao Zhu was packing things in the room. She walked in to take a look and came out again. She asked Xiao Huan, who was sitting in the courtyard in confusion, "Xiao Huan, we will be leaving in a few days. Why haven't you packed yet? What are you doing here, eating melon seeds? Young master likes to eat, but he doesn't like to eat. I am peeling some for young master." Xiao Huan turned around and smiled. "You guys pack first. I have nothing to pack. I will be done an hour before we leave." Xiao Chui looked at the bowl of melon seeds in front of her and her scratched fingers. She grabbed Xiao Chui's hand and said angrily, "Are you stupid? Your hand is already like this. Why are you still peeling?" Xiao Huan pulled her hand back. Her eyes curved, smiled, and said, "It's okay, you." Although Xiao Huan was usually so gentle, but when it came to things, Xiao Chui could never be stubborn. She went back to the room angrily, looked outside, and said discontentedly, "You say, why is this girl so stubborn?" Xiao Zhu came over, sighed, and said, "She's stubborn for a long time. Instead of worrying about Xiao Huan, it is better to worry about ourselves. Xiao Huan is much luckier than us. Did you guys hear Prince and Princess are going out again? I heard from Sister Xiao Zhu and Sister Xiao Chui. This time they will be out for a long time. I really envy Sister Xiao Zhu and Sister Xiao Chui. They follow Second Madam and Third Madam. They bring them everywhere. They are the servant girls of Second Madam and Third Madam. They will serve them in bed in the future. They are not the same as us. That is not necessarily true. Look at Sister Xiao Huan. She is the princess's servant girl. She has been with Prince for a long time. She has not been taken in as a concubine yet. You guys guess, could it be that Prince does not like her? I think it is possible. Xiao Huan is not like Sister Xiao Zhu and Sister Xiao Chui. She looks silly. How could Prince like her all of? You shut up. There was Jiang of Silla in the capital, Jiang of Silla in Rui City, and Jiang of Silla in Shu Province. When he left the capital, he left some servant girls to look after the house, took some with him, and left some in Shu Province. In Rui City, the servant girls in the house, only a few had been by his side since he was in the capital. The rest were new recruits. The one who spoke harshly at this time was a servant girl called Xiao Qing. When she was in the capital, she worked in the prince's house, and in this Rui City, she was also the head servant of the house, a small housekeeper. Among the servant girls, her position was only below that of Xiao Huan and the other two. At this moment, her face was full of anger. Looking at the two chatting servant girls, she said angrily, "What have I usually taught you? Is this something you can say?" Perhaps it was because Xiao Qing's usual amiable image had been deeply ingrained in people's hearts. One of the servant girls pouted and said, "Sister Xiao Qing, we are not wrong." "That's right, that Xiao Huan looks silly." The other person also chimed in. "You." Xiao Qing raised her eyebrows and was about to reprimand, but suddenly looked behind the crowd, bowed, and said, "Prince." Li looked indifferently at the two servant girls in the crowd, waved his hand, and said, "Pack your things today. Go back to where you came from." The two of them paled and knelt on the ground with a thud. "Prince," Li waved his hand. "Let's go before I change my mind." Hearing this, the two of them trembled and broke out in a cold sweat, immediately got up and left in a hurry. The other servant girls' faces were also slightly pale. They knew that when Prince said that he did not change his mind, he did not mean that he would forgive them. Criticizing behind their backs was a big taboo for them as servants. In those big clans, it was a taboo. No one expected that Prince, who was usually amiable and did not speak harshly to anyone, would be so angry just because they said a few bad words about Miss Xiao Huan. Li Yi glanced at the maidservants. Although his gaze was gentle, everyone shuddered when they thought of the two sentences he had said in such a calm manner. Third year of Jingping, 21st of March. This was a very ordinary day. Li Yi sat in the study, looking at a map of the Qi Kingdom. Xiao Huan pushed the door open and came in, placed a small bag on the table, and said softly, "Young master, I peeled some melon seeds. There is no skin. You should eat it soon. It will not taste good after a long time. Okay." Li Yi nodded. "Young master, remember to eat. I will go down first." Xiao Huan smiled sweetly, turned around, a trace of undetectable disappointment appearing on her face. This trace of disappointment quickly turned into a smile. She sniffed and walked out of the study. She only took one step, and then she could not take another step, because Li Yi grabbed her hand. "You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.